According to your records, your entry here was an accident unlikely to be duplicated. With that in mind, plus all you have said, it seems to us that Megas 2 is safe. But Lucian must be punished. For his betrayal of his people, he shall be confined in limbo for all eternity, to live with only himself.
No. To isolate someone like Lucian, that's the same as sentencing him to death.
Do you realize who you defend? He has told you his name is Lucian. Would you defend him still if you knew he had another name, too? The Rollicker, the Tempter, Lucifer.
We're not interested in legend. He's a living being, an intelligent life form. That's all we have to know about him. We will not join in harming him.
Submit, Captain. You haven't the power to fight us.
Captain, use the magic you know. Believe.
The EscapeGoat podcast. A podcast series featuring the discussion of many different topics, flaws and all, based on personal whims and fascinations. Hosted by me, David Fagiani, and several different guests. I actually grew up in a very Irish neighbourhood of South Manchester, to the extent that because me and my brother aren't Irish, we don't, we're not Catholic or anything, but me and my brother actually had mass envy because so many kids on our street went to mass, and we assumed it must be really cool, and fun. So.
What's interesting about being Irish is that never leaves you. So, like, my mum still goes to mass. I would say she still goes to mass religiously. But when we go, like, my siblings and I might be back for Christmas or whatever, and we'll go with her. It's weird how you can fall back into the habit and you remember it because it's been drilled into you so much. And, like, occasionally they will change particular passages and it feels so uncomfortable because you immediately slip back into the rote learning of, and peace be with you, or... this is the gift of my fruit or whatever, that sort of stuff. And then they're like, no, wrong cue.
Right, I'm trying to think how any of this could be applicable to Star Trek fandom. I think it's quite transferable.
Yeah, I mean, there is a canon. It's no coincidence that fandom uses the same language that we associate with religion, to the point where, like, you could argue that certain things are heresy.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I've been following some. I mean, obviously, this isn't. I don't want to get us down this avenue and waste half the podcast on it. But I've been following some of your writings and other musings on Star Trek Picard because I watched all of that eventually, and yeah, I think we're on fairly similar pages with it.
I'm glad people like it. I just didn't. I know that sounds dismissive, and I know people think you're just being kind of like, fob it off kind of thing, or condescending or whatever. Genuinely glad people love it. Genuinely glad, particularly people who maybe Star Trek hasn't been for them to love it or whatever. But it for me, it did not work. And what's kind of strange is I found the response to engaging with it critically to be quite unnerving. Where, like, I was around. I'm like, again, I don't know if this is podcast or just off the record or whatever, but, like, I remember when I was a kid being on the message boards, and I am, not to give my age away, like, old enough to be a veteran of the message boards in the Braga and Berman era.
Right.
And, like, again, there are legitimate criticisms to be made of both Berman and Braga, particularly we found out in the years since. I mean, there are, obviously the Terry Farrell stuff with Berman that came out in, like, the 50-year mission and all that sort of stuff. The DS9 documentary. Braga, there's various quotes of people who have worked with him who found him very difficult in a less, Me Too-ish kind of way, just a more difficult individual to work with. very young, very, very young to be given the responsibility he was, not necessarily comfortable managing a writer's room, that sort of stuff. And according to like Brian Fuller, very, very insecure about that as well.
Right.
But like the hatred and the venom that was online then, it was kind of insane. And it's kind of weird to have like traumatic flashbacks to that, but in the opposite direction, where it's like, if you were in the 2000s and you were like, Voyager's pretty good, or Enterprise is pretty good this year, it was like, oh my God, what are you thinking? You've committed some sort of crime against nature. And now it's kind of interesting that it's like, third season of Picard wasn't really for me. And it's like, what the hell are you talking about? You must murder puppies.
Yeah.
It's a very strange, charged kind of, some fandoms changes and sometimes it doesn't change, which is interesting.
It just feels very, I don't know, like, you'll have a perhaps longer perspective or deeper perspective on this, but it feels like a very insecure fandom at the moment, which I don't know if that's a sort of equivalent of Doctor Who post-cancellation, where we kind of had our version of the wilderness years and now everyone's very on edge, or just, obviously there's all the aesthetic change, which, older fans find it hard to take to, and I include myself in that, it just feels very unsettled, I don't know if that's sort of dominating, if that's setting some of the tone,
I don't think it's quite that, because I think that the same thing you can see happening with like MCU fandom at the moment, where they've never had a wilderness period. Like the MCU fandom has never had an era where they weren't the biggest things in the history of the world, and then immediately the suggestion that they might not be the biggest thing in the world. And like even legitimate, like again, superhero fatigue, greatly exaggerated, all that sort of stuff, but it's like maybe the MCU is like the third biggest thing in the world, and all of a sudden everybody's jumping down your throat and your mentions are filled with people going, why do you hate XYZ? Why are you an awful person? Why do you hate diversity? That sort of stuff. I don't think it's necessarily tied to any traumatic memory, particularly because, like, what I find really weird is that we live in an age where, and again, this is not to turn this into a discussion of modern Star Trek podcast or whatever. One of my big issues with like the recent wave of like fan-pleasing Star Trek projects, which seem to have, arguably smaller audiences, or at least more devoted online audiences, in that, like, I remember the first season of Discovery getting coverage in, like, New York Magazine, getting greater coverage in places like Vulture, Vox, all that sort of place, like, actually being part of the larger cultural conversation. Star Trek's back, we're excited to hear about it, Rolling Stone, all that sort of stuff, and it feels like, as much as fans love the third season of Star Trek Picard, it doesn't feel like that impact was there for it, as much as fans might love Strange New Worlds. It doesn't seem like it's there for it. Like, my parents watched Discovery. They didn't watch Picard. They didn't watch Strange New Worlds. That sort of level of cultural impact. I think, like, what I find strange about it is we live in an age where all of the older stuff is quicker to hand than it ever was before. And particularly, it's quicker to hand on the exact same service where you're getting the new stuff.
Yeah, often, yeah.
Yeah, that's it. It's not like you need two separate subscriptions in America to watch, Star Trek The Next Generation and Star Trek Strange New Worlds. You can watch both of them for the same monthly fee with the same number of clicks. And I'm like watching that and I'm like, then why is the ideal form of, say, Strange New Worlds or Star Trek Picard treated as like an imitation of something that I can just watch directly, that I can just watch the original version of it, the version of it that I love, the version of it that I know works for me, the version that I obviously presumably want to see regurgitated back to me. I can just click a mouse and see that directly, preserved perfectly, often restored in HD, looking more beautiful than it ever did, at any time I watched it on TV. Why am I so obsessed with the idea that, it's good that Strange New Worlds is doing episodes that are like spot the reference, where it's like, oh, look, that one is a bit of, it's like, what if yesterday's Enterprise meets City on the Edge of Forever meets Balance of Terror? And it's like, I could just watch those 3 episodes in high definition on the same streaming service. And I would probably have a better experience. I would.
I've seen
I don't know.
I've seen like 2 episodes of Strange New Worlds, and I don't have much time for it. But it's partly because of the road that's got us here. Not to joke, but it's been a long road.
And getting from there to here, but your time is finally here, David.
Well, I think my thing with Strange New Worlds is it looks like it's basically the Orville, and I know that's probably not a very fresh argument, and I'm bringing all my prejudices about that to it, and I'm bringing all my prejudices about the kind of the last few years in general of Star Trek that I've mostly mildly to strongly disliked, essentially. And so I quite believe it when people say that there's like an episode of Strange New Worlds they love, or that stands out from the pack, or that is the best episode of Trek in years, or whatever. But I don't really think overall it's going to work for me. And I suppose it's just getting to the point where, and maybe this is just an age thing as well. It's getting to the stage where I've been burned enough, basically, and that's when you start to get into, that's when you do start to get old, isn't it? Because you get into your sort of caution force field. You have your shields up, so to speak.
I only have so many hours left on this planet, and I have to start choosing how I use them wisely.
Kind of.
I like the thing with Strange New Worlds is that it is, with all due respect to it and not wanting to dismiss it and accepting that this is maybe what some fans love about it, it is an extremely mediocre episode of Voyager or the first 2 seasons of Enterprise. Like, that is what it aspires to be. That is what it accomplishes. That is the bullseye that it hits. Like, this is the thing. And again, I worry that it sounds like I'm being mean or dismissive. People like what they like, and if it gives you joy, that's fantastic. I'm wrong, don't listen to me, etc. But it's very similar to like the wave of like Stranger Things inspired kind of like 80s children's film nostalgia stuff that comes out, and talking about like things like We Have a Ghost, for example, or Bumblebee, or any of those kind of projects, which are designed to kind of like make you remember movies like The Goonies, for example, that sort of thing. And my problem with those is that like The Goonies is great if you're watching it when you're 8 years old. It is not a good movie. And if your primary artistic ambition is to faithfully replicate something that was not great the first time around, I don't really buy into it. Like the formula that like Strange New Worlds is replicating is, for me, and I don't want to be this negative, and I'm sorry that I'm kind of like setting the tone here, but for me, Strange New Worlds is kind of emulating the formula that defined the 7 years of Voyager and the first 2 years of Enterprise, which was already stale reheats of an episodic standalone format that had gone through iterations on Star Trek The Next Generation and Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and it reached a point where it was so unsustainable that they basically had to reboot Enterprise like halfway through, do a season-long arc, and when that didn't work, reboot it again and do a set of 2 or 3 episode arcs in order to find a way to tell new stories. It's like perfectly emulating what was already a faded photocopy of a faded photocopy of something that worked in 1994. And like I personally just can't accept. I realize this sounds very emotional, maybe it is, but I can't wrap my head around the idea that is the ideal form for this franchise.
Yeah.
That's the part that gets me. It's the bit where everyone's like, oh, it's like Star Trek like it was meant to be. Like it was always meant to be. And I'm like, no. Yeah. Like Star Trek in 1994 looked like Star Trek in 1994 because it was made in 1994. Yeah. It looked very different from Star Trek that was made in 1966. It looked very different from Star Trek Deep Space Nine, which was made in 1999. It looked very different from Enterprise, which was made in like 2003, 2004.
Yeah.
Like Star Trek in 1994 was perfect television for 1994. We're not in 1994, and we're not even on television anymore.
Yeah, well, look how different even TNG at the tail end in 94 looked from TNG in 87, for example. And now we've got the distance to see that more, but like... I mean, we will get off this and we'll beam ourselves happily back to 1996 in a minute, but I should say that one of the episodes of Strange New Worlds I have seen is let me get this right, the first season finale. And
That's a Quality of Mercy, yeah.
Well, I watched that partly because of your review of that, because it sounded insane. And then I watched it, and I was almost... I don't want to be overdramatic, because I really do have a sense of perspective. I'm an adult. But I was almost horrified, because I was like, what is happening here? What is this doing? What is this trying to do, this episode? What is this bizarre artifact that I have here before me, Which, to be fair, your review gave me fair warning,
I tried. I mean, without getting too much into it, I think that is a problem I have with a lot of like modern franchise media, where like the original things that these are based on were stories about the larger modern world, right? They, whatever about a modern franchise, it originally began with a film or television show that was anchored in a particular moment. Star Wars in 1977 was a response to Richard Nixon, Vietnam, all this sort of stuff. It was caught up in the cultural stew of 1977. You went to the cinema, you saw it, and you saw like this funhouse mirror prism of the world as it was. Same thing with Star Trek in 1966. You know, like that was a show that was traipsing through the trail end of the 60s, a very turbulent, very chaotic decade. Like, you know, we'll talk maybe about Friday's Child when we talk about like the novel we're ostensibly here to discuss.
Yes, please.
But like it was constantly navigating things like, say, Vietnam, the counterculture, the youth movement. There was this like sense of the universe as a dead and dying place, mutually assured destruction, the Cold War, all this anxiety, youth culture, all these stories about like children who had grown too powerful and would destroy their parents. And it's like, what do you think the subtext of that was in 1966 in the middle of a youth revolution?
See also Star Trek Picard Series 3.
Yeah, well, okay, yeah, Star Trek Picard Series 3 is exactly that. But I mean, you get to Strange New Worlds and you get to modern franchises, and it increasingly seems like so much of what they are, at least consciously talking about, is about themselves. They're about the franchise. They're about like continuity. They're about canon. Like that's the thing with A Quality of Mercy, which, just to recap it very, very briefly, is like an alternate universe fanfic of Balance of Terror, which is basically about how if Pike didn't get in the accident that left him in the wheelchair and therefore like horribly scarred and unable to communicate and in constant agony, able to communicate only through a series of blinking lights, if that didn't happen, the incident in Balance of Terror would lead to full-scale war between the Romulans and Federation that would lead to billions and billions of deaths and possibly destroy the entire Star Trek franchise, right? Now, the original Balance of Terror, it was made in 1966. It is a story about two rival nations in space, one of whom has developed an incredibly advanced technology and who find themselves on the brink of restarting a war that could potentially destroy a fragile peace. It's not subtle. It's written by veterans of the Second World War in the style of submarine warfare, but it's also about the Cold War and fundamentally about the idea that even though we exist on other sides of ideological divides, there's a fundamental humanity and decency that defines us. You know, in another life, I might have called you friend. That basic idea. It is about something like beyond the fact that it is a Star Trek episode that introduces the Romulans. Like that's a caveat. That's the third thing it's about or whatever. And that's only something we apply retroactively through canon. On the other hand, you look at something like A Quality of Mercy, that season finale of Strange New Worlds, and it's like, that doesn't say anything about anything except Star Trek continuity. Yeah. Like, it's only about the idea that you as an audience member need to understand that Pike needs to end up in the wheelchair for this franchise that you love to continue, for the canon to be preserved, for like this franchise to continue to have internal consistency. And setting aside like whether that's an interesting moral debate to have, which is, I would argue that, you know, I'm a fan of Across the Spider-Verse, a movie that is in cinemas now and it's absolutely fantastic. And one of the core themes of that is the idea that maybe the canon isn't like more important than human suffering. Maybe the idea that we have told stories about suffering in the past doesn't mean we have to continue to tell stories about suffering forever. But it's also not a story that speaks to the current moment. It doesn't say anything about like where America is right now, where the world is right now. It doesn't tell you anything about like what Star Trek is in relation to the outside world. It only tells you what Star Trek is in relation to itself. It's a hall of mirrors. It's very solipsistic. And it suggests that like the only thing that Star Trek cares about is Star Trek. And it's like, that's not what I personally like about Star Trek. I love Star Trek as a window like out into another world, but also as a mirror that reflects our own. And like that's my problem with so much modern franchise media, where it really does feel like it exists. Like Obi-Wan Kenobi, what does that say about like, you know, the world as it is in 2022, apart from like explaining a continuity gaffe in the original Star Wars that wasn't a continuity gaffe that was resolved by Obi-Wan Kenobi using the phrase "a certain point of view" in Return of the Jedi. Yeah, that's the thing that I find frustrating about like modern franchises, where they kind of refract and echo and mirror and become copies of copies of copies that are only really engaged in conversations about themselves. Yeah,
well, I agree with all of that. I think you know what's a good bridge vaguely towards the topic of the podcast, and certainly chronologically.
Sorry.
No. I was thinking of a way to steer it around to that because I think we're talking about what Star Trek means and what the franchise is like in 2023 in our opinions, and what it's been like for the last few years and what it means to us now, I suppose, at this stage in our lives to differing degrees. and inevitably in this podcast we're going to talk a bit about 1996 and where things were at in 1996, the 30th anniversary year of Star Trek, right? Because I should by the way, welcome to the EscapeGoat podcast. This is
sorry, I just started talking.
Yeah, a lot of them go like that, but I just thought I'd formally put like a little capstone on it. I'd actually, I'd like to, I don't know, I'll shuffle this around or what, but I'd
go
like to introduce...
like whatever. Like if it works, it works. I just love the idea that I so hijacked the podcast you forgot to introduce.
Yeah, this guest has just been rambling away, and we'll introduce him eventually. This is my guest Darren Mooney. Hi, Darren.
Hello. How are things? I'm the person you've been hearing rambling for the past God knows how long. Thrilled to be here.
Entertaining.
Thank you for having me. It's a thrill to be here.
No, thank you for joining us. I was actually. I was going to sort of preface this entire episode by saying some of these episodes, I obviously, I tend to sort of pick the topics, but I pick them collaboratively, and sometimes it's something I'm extremely passionate about, and sometimes I pick it because me and the guests are both passionate about it, and sometimes it's more of a kind of like a one for them in a sense, like it's something they're very passionate about, but I know they're brilliant, so they'll be entertaining, and I'll learn a lot. This is unashamedly a one for me, basically, and I know it's one for you too. It's interesting, actually, because the EscapeGoat podcast wanders, because of the sort of show it is, or I choose it to be, it wanders all over the place. But back when we were starting it off, me and my good friend Isabel, we did a couple of episodes about Star Trek really early on. Episode 2, and I believe it was episode 6 of the show, were about Star Trek Voyager and mostly about All Good Things, the other one. And we had a really great time talking about them. But I've noticed in the 50-odd episodes I've had since then, apart from the occasional reference, very frequent reference really, I've sort of steered clear of doing Star Trek-y ones. And I was thinking that part of that is just like enough self-awareness to realise that the internet is absolutely chock-a-block with Star Trek stuff, a lot of which I listen to already. Not limited to your podcast, but that kind of material where a lot of what I obsess about, and it's ebbed and flowed over my life. We could talk about that as well. Is about Star Trek, and it is fascinating. But I'm not sure how much I have to bring. It's kind of because you've got to kind of have a bit of a USP or an in or something, haven't you? Or even just something that's relatively culturally obscure to talk about. And obviously, you'll know that we've gone that route on this episode tonight because we've certainly found something that's fairly obscure, I'd say.
You mean the internet isn't full of podcasts discussing the first book in the Invasion crossover event that ran through Pocket's Star Trek line in 1996 to mark the 30th anniversary of the franchise?
Yeah, I like also that at least in theory I'm planning on covering the other books as well with future guests. Yes. So this is specifically about the first book. Yeah. So that's how niche it is. Yeah. So if you tuned in to hear about any of the rest of it, this is not for you. So we've already shrunk our audience base.
I do love the idea that you may or may not get around to the remaining 3 books. I like that. We'll play it by ear. We'll figure it out. We'll look at the ratings. We may drop the series halfway through.
That'll be my Winds of Winter, that's the thing that's going to follow me around for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
Are you working on them? I think let's talk a little bit more about where Star Trek fandom and our fandom specifically was at in 1996, because you said before you didn't want to specifically discuss your age, but I think we might tangentially...
You may have figured it out. You may have, listeners with a pencil and a piece of paper may have been able to work it out from context.
There might be some breadcrumbs in this episode. I was saying about both our ages. I was born in the mid '80s, so I was I was like probably 10, 11 maybe when I got hold of a copy of this book. And as I mentioned before, that was the Star Trek 30th anniversary year, 96. I was thinking about kind of all other respects of where I was at in 96 actually, because that was I had a real... I was already playing Nintendo games and stuff. I had a Super Nintendo, but I actually realised that late 96 in the UK was when I got my N64 as well.
Oh, wow.
So 96 basically gave me the fuels of interest that carried me through into the 2000s, because I was obsessively into the N64 for a good... it seemed like an eternity at the time, but probably a good 3 years or something like that, But I was into Star Trek already in 1996, and we'll talk a bit about how that came about in both our lives, I guess. One thing I remember in 96 was I was buying Star Trek Monthly magazine.
Yes.
Every month I'd either go to the newsagent or maybe I had a subscription by this point, but I was buying Star Trek Monthly magazine, and I believe the reason I have First Strike, the first book of the Invasion series, is it was given away as a cover mount freebie on an issue of Star Trek Monthly. Which I should have checked down what issue that was, but I guess it would be in the mid-90s somewhere, in mid-96. But it was funny, I was thinking about that now because... did
it work? Did you buy the other 3?
I did, yeah.
Fantastic. So it worked. They hooked you.
It did work in that sense. Yeah, they made their money back. But I was just thinking about how weirdly, I mean, the 90s just seems like a long time ago in all sorts of respects now, doesn't it? It's certainly very technologically different from the way we consume media and writing and criticism now. But I was just thinking, quite a lot of my sort of culture in the 90s was magazines. I used to get like collectible magazines. I used to get
the Star Trek Fact Files.
Definitely got the Star Trek Fact Files. Yeah, was all over those. So I'm already telling you a bit about the sort of fan I was at this stage.
Oh no, I have them in the attic. I couldn't throw them out. I love them so much. They're just they're childhood treasures. They're part of my experience of Star Trek as well.
Yeah, no, they're absolutely fantastic. They were kind of like weekly things that came out that you could build up a sort of almost like an encyclopedia of your own, about Star Trek, as well as having the Star Trek encyclopedia. So that's kind of the level I was at. But it's funny, I was just thinking in terms of Star Trek Monthly. I'm not sure where my copies of that are. They're probably in an attic somewhere as well. But I was just thinking, I wonder what a 11-year-old kid was getting out of profile pieces on Robert Beltran in 1996. I wonder how I was ingesting that stuff.
I have like a very, as I mentioned, I am a year younger than you, I'm guessing, because I would have been like 9 years old for the anniversary. And I would have been aware of like Voyager is one of the, like, Star Trek for me is notable as it's one of the key moments for me kind of as an emerging critic or writer or person who thinks about television, because it and the X-Files were the first time I started paying attention to the idea of writers, the idea of authors in like text, particularly in like live action text, because obviously in film you have directors, and I think like Tim Burton is like, for people of our generation, baby's first auteur, because he's the most recognizable director who works in films that people of our generation saw at the youngest age, if that makes sense. But in terms of like television, which has always been seen as more of a writer's medium, it was the X-Files and it was Star Trek were the ones where I started noticing that there were writers some episodes were better than others, and I was trying to figure out what it was. It wasn't like, and it wasn't, first stage was, okay, are Data episodes inherently better than Riker episodes? And it's like, no, that's not what it is. And then I start paying attention to the credits, and I start noticing that, if it has a Ronald D. Moore credit on it, it tends to be pretty decent. If it has a Renee Echevarria credit on it, it tends to be pretty decent. And, like, they have particular interests. Like, Moore has this interest in kind of the realpolitik of the Star Trek universe. Echevarria is much more interested in the interpersonal kind of character dynamics and relationships that exist. All that sort of stuff. And again, over in the X-Files, you start noticing that, like, Mulder and Scully are almost completely different people depending on who's writing the episode. Mulder is, like, the perfect man when he's written by Chris Carter, but this gigantic idiot buffoon when he's written by Darren Morgan. Scully is like Captain Killjoy when she's written by like Carter, but all of a sudden becomes the only sane woman in the universe when she's written by Glenn Morgan and James Wong. See, like, I remember it being kind of a large part, and I think that the magazines were a large part of that for me as well, because they go behind the scenes, they break down, they talk to the people who make this stuff, and they give you a glimpse behind the mechanics of like how it's made. And I think Voyager is kind of interesting. I love that you mentioned Robert Beltran and the feature on Robert Beltran, because I remember Voyager being the first instance of, like, in real time becoming aware that something that I am watching on TV could be, like, the fruit of, I don't want to say the poison tree, but could be the fruit of a very troubled production, where so much of, like, what was happening behind the scenes in Voyager, and again, you can read in the 50-year mission, which is a fantastic oral history of the Star Trek franchise. They delve into it a great deal there. But if you were reading even Star Trek Magazine, which, by the way, was an official publication tied to the Star Trek franchise, and therefore, like, a propaganda mouthpiece, but even if you were reading, say, Starlog or Cine Fantastique, you'd start seeing, like, people involved in Voyager talking candidly about the production while it was still on the air. And like, when you mentioned Beltran, I was like, no, Beltran's interviews were like the best thing, because Beltran was like the Voyager cast member who at the time would be talking about how much he hated working on the show and how frustrated he was with how his character was being handled and how much trouble it was and how he had to fight to get this idea across and how all this sort of stuff. Like, yeah, I think like the Star Trek fandom in the 90s was fascinating because it was this kind of interesting paramedia thing where you become aware of how the sausage is made while also still loving the taste of a really good sausage.
Yeah, well, you're at that age as well, and it is all fascinating. And I mean, like you mentioned Voyager before. Like Voyager's, I think I was just sort of thinking this out loud, but as we go through it. But I guess Voyager's one of the first shows I was aware of its launch. I was like, I was aware that it was coming. And I was aware that at that stage of my Star Trek fandom, this was a big deal. And even at that age, I was becoming slightly discerning to the point where I was like, I wonder if Voyager will be good or not. Now, obviously, the things I meant about would Voyager be good or not were probably not the same things I'd apply now as criteria. But I did have an idea of this will not necessarily be good. It'll be more Star Trek.
Well, I mean, like, I remember the moment I realized that media could be bad, and that was watching Batman Forever on a plane, which was probably in 1996, to tie this all back together, because Batman Forever was released in, was it the summer of 95? But I was on a plane coming back from, Ghana, where I lived as a kid, and I remember watching Batman Forever, and, having to grapple with that existential thing of, I like Batman. I like Batman movies. Why don't I like this movie, which has...
Something's awry.
Yeah, something's wrong here. There was a Batman movie, which should be all it takes for a movie to be good. But this movie was not good. And why was that? Which is maybe my origin story as a critic, sitting on an 8-hour flight trying to figure out why Batman Forever was bad, despite having Batman who is good in it.
And in many ways, you're still mentally sitting on that flight.
I am. I never landed. That plane has never landed. Hashtag release the Schumacher cut.
Well, you know what? Very brief sidebar. I actually just 2 weeks ago went to screening of Batman Forever in Manchester, and I actually, well, I mean, not only did I enjoy it because it's ridiculous, but I actually found things in it pretty good. You know what? I don't know if I've just been drinking or something, but I actually found the ending strangely moving, and I can't believe I'm saying that in public.
No. I mean, the sequences with the bat is very clever. The sequence, the mum and dad stuff is potentially interesting.
Potentially is the right word there, I think. Yeah.
No, but I mean, I am very curious to see what Schumacher's alternate cut of the movie is. My scorching hot take that will blow up the internet is that Batman and Robin is a much better movie than Batman Forever. But we don't have time to pull the pin out of that grenade, I don't think.
No. But I'm very interested to have you back in the future to talk about that one. But maybe it was just the year we've had so far that made me react that way to Batman Forever. But no, it's interesting. I mean, let's talk actually a little bit, because we talk about 96, and you've mentioned in your writing several times that what a year 96 was for the franchise. Not just arbitrarily being the 30th anniversary, but the sort of imperial state that Star Trek was in culturally at that point. It was in terms of the amount of it, which obviously you could say that's where the biggest parallel to this current era of Star Trek is that we're in at the moment. Because there's a glut of it. There's arguably too much Star Trek out.
That's going to take care of itself, and it's going to have nothing to do with quality. We are past peak television. It's peak Star Trek and peak TV lining up. I think we are past peak Star Trek and we're past peak television. There's a reason why they haven't been commissioning shows as regularly as they have been in recent history.
Yeah. Thinking about 96, I was just realizing the end of 96 was when I saw First Contact.
Yes.
I actually saw First Contact. I think I mentioned this on the previous one when we talked about Star Trek, but I saw that in Australia on holiday with my dad, and that was at the very tail end of 96. I love that I went to such a beautiful hot country and spent 3 hours of it sitting in the dark.
Air conditioning in a cinema.
It's funny. I want to, partly because we're going to be talking about First Strike, which is for people who don't know, I should say, is we'll get into more. We'll get into more about what that is, really. Yeah. But the first thing you need to know is it's a crossover event novel, and specifically First Strike is a TOS novel. It's one with Kirk, Spock, McCoy, etc., the original series crew. I'm just realizing also 96, with being the anniversary year, that's the Trials and Tribulations year, isn't it? That's when DS9 does.
Yeah, and obviously Voyager has its own episode with Flashback where they bring back Sulu for a weird thing. The where Tuvok has the memory illness, and so they go and they meet Sulu's there on the Excelsior.
Yeah, I rewatched that one earlier this year. That's a bizarre episode.
It's a very strange episode because it largely seems like it could be about anything. It's not specifically about the 30th anniversary of Star Trek. It could be about literally anything, and it's
like the plot is about someone crossing a road from point A to point C, and the point B they walk through is the undiscovered country.
It's a deleted scene. A deleted scene from it where the entire point of the deleted scene is what if Sulu went to help Kirk and Spock, but then turned around and didn't. That's the core.
It's so weird.
It's such a strange episode of television. Largely written by, I think, people who don't necessarily seem to care that much about the original Star Trek, which is fine. I mean, the famous story is when Brannon Braga joined, and again, this gives you a sense of how toxic the internet was in the late 90s. Braga, when he joined Star Trek, was told literally by Roddenberry himself, when he was working as an intern on The Next Generation, and had established himself as a writer with a great deal of talent. And look, I was mean about Braga as a showrunner earlier. I think those criticisms are valid. I also think that Braga is, allowing for episodes like Threshold, for example, a pretty good writer on a case-by-case basis. I think he's one of the stronger and more interesting writers to have worked on The Next Generation. And he was told by Roddenberry not to go back and rewatch the original Star Trek, that he should maintain his fresh perspective. He should act as an outsider. He should be a newcomer. He should be writing Star Trek like he had never heard of Star Trek outside of the show that he was working on, which would be insane today. Can you imagine anybody working on, let alone running, a franchise being like, yeah, you know, the guy who used to run it told me not to watch the old stuff, so I didn't. Like, can you imagine how the internet would react to that? And to be fair, the internet did react in that way to Braga. And Braga, you know, I think as he got towards the tail end of Enterprise, was like, yeah, I finally went back and watched the original Star Trek because the internet just wouldn't shut up about it. But I kind of find it fascinating that, you know, Flashback comes from Voyager at a point where it is transitioning from Jerry Taylor being in charge, who's very much, again, a hired hand TV veteran, not necessarily a hardcore Star Trek fan, to Brannon Braga, who's this young pup who's been raised entirely within the franchise, but also hasn't watched the original Star Trek at all. And together they're like, what if we did something for the 30th anniversary?
Yeah, but what? But what, they asked themselves.
Yeah, and it was referencing that movie from like 5 years ago. The most recent piece of media featuring these characters.
You know, that's an interesting aspect to the way that you consume quite a lot of media when you're a kid, even when you were such a savvy kid, as you know, who knew quite a lot about Star Trek trivia and was probably already getting the fact files at that time. I really had no feeling for how old a piece of media Star Trek 6 was.
Yeah.
You know, I just, for me, it sort of always existed, you know, and, but as you say, it's what 5 years distant at that point, and but it felt like they were digging from the distant past. And I think that's because I was a bit, well, I'm not sure if I was a bit young innately, but I certainly didn't see Star Trek 6 at the cinema. The first one I saw at the cinema was Generations. So that's when they start seeming like real movies that exist in my world, basically, you know, like events.
That they're situated in your life. The arrival of those movies overlaps with something that you remember specifically, and therefore they're tied to it, as opposed to just existing.
Yeah. Whereas 1 to 6 might as well have just been scripture, you know, that basically like unturned somewhere in the attic, you know. Like,
yeah, they all materialized in like 1966, September 1966. 79 episodes appeared and 6 movies were found. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, actually, that's a really good into the original series, because I kind of want to talk to you about, I guess we're kind of doing this in reverse order, but like kind of, I'm sure you've touched on this in your extensive work about Star Trek, but how did you first get into Star Trek, and was it via the original series or was it via TNG?
No, it was via TNG. And the thing that I remember getting into Star Trek was The Next Generation, and this is something to talk about in terms of like Star Trek and in terms of fandom and in terms of the idea of geekdom. Star Trek The Next Generation was not a geek show. It was not a niche show. It was not a nerd show. It was like one of the biggest shows on television. It was a cultural juggernaut. It was not like something that was seen as being particularly nerdy, at least in Europe where I was raised. But it was not seen as something that was like geeky or embarrassing or its own little pocket universe in the way that it kind of became, I would argue, once it shifted to airing on UPN, which not everybody could access, and as it became increasingly mired in its own continuity and references and callbacks and nostalgia and all this sort of stuff. When The Next Generation was on the air, it was just a TV show. The 7th season got an Emmy nomination for Outstanding Drama. And a fact I absolutely love is that the 3rd season of Deep Space Nine, which featured several writers who had worked on that season of The Next Generation, features a subplot in which Bashir is nominated for an award that he has no chance of winning, but gradually convinces himself that he will win and then doesn't win, which I think Ronald D. Moore has said that was not a very subtle jab to how so many of the writers and producers on The Next Generation started to act once they got that nomination. But like, I remember watching The Next Generation with my grandparents. My gran had all of The Next Generation on VHS. We would watch the reruns when they were on. Again, you're British, so you're probably aware of this. Sky 1, 5 o'clock, Monday to Friday. They would just like continuously show Star Trek The Next Generation, and then would occasionally cycle in some early Deep Space Nine and then Voyager as well.
We didn't have Sky yet at this point, so we were still on the BBC Two diet. Whatever BBC Two had.
So that's weekly, isn't it? That was like Thursday at 6:45 or something, if I remember
correctly. Kind of thing.
Yeah.
That kind of thing, yeah. And it was primarily Next Generation, but my dad had a mate who used to tape the new DS9s off Sky for me. So I remember, for example, this is such a culturally specific mid-90s memory, but I remember he taped one of those so I guess I was watching a second season episode of DS9, and I remember seeing the advert for Crossover, where Kira says something like, "Have you ever heard of James T. Kirk?" And I was just like, "Whoa, what? What are they doing?"
Mind blowing.
And that was me as like a 9-year-old or something. You know, that was a big moment.
But like the way that I remember it working is Next Generation I watched with my gran and granddad. Then like I got onto the hard stuff, which is I went on to Deep Space Nine by myself. Deep Space Nine was always a bit weirder, a bit more confrontational in places, a bit angrier. I would argue in retrospect a bit more prestige TV, or I think it's like Buffy. Or even arguably like Sex and the City. It's understood as like a genre precursor. Babylon 5 as well, to like what became the prestige age of television, where you take these genre shows that should be light entertainment and start threading in like serious dramatic writing and character arcs into them and start taking them very seriously. And then you get to, you know, obviously like The Sopranos, which is like, what if we did it with a gangster show and it becomes like the golden age of television. But I remember going into Deep Space Nine myself, and I remember every week I would get like pocket money, and I would save my pocket money. This is how old I am. And I would go to the video store, which is a concept I worry I may have to explain to some of your listeners. But I would buy once a month or however, whenever it would come out, I would buy Deep Space Nine on VHS. In fact, I actually still own the VHS cassettes because they have wonderful artwork on them. And I'm trying to figure out what I can do with them, because the pencil drawings on the Deep Space Nine VHS covers, and I recommend if listeners have not seen them, Google them. They are absolutely gorgeous.
I remember the kind of swirling wormhole effects, and you get different faces on them and stuff like that. Yeah, I don't know if we're getting exactly the same ones, but I remember that kind of thing.
That's it exactly. Like, so the Voyager and Next Generation ones would just be like, well, here's a bunch of pictures from the cassette tape that you bought. And it's like, oh, okay, so look, Data is a cowboy in this one, I can tell, because they put a picture of Data in a cowboy as a cowboy hat in the triangle at the bottom of the VHS.
Well, they were still very 80s sorts of designs, weren't they? That was kind of the aesthetic from the 80s of how videos should look, I think.
Yeah, triangles, pyramids, and colors. And whereas Deep Space Nine had this kind of more classical sensibility where you had like pencil illustrations. So like like you'd have like a half of Garak's face on the cover, or you'd have like for Arman Bashir, you'd have Julian Bashir as James Bond, like drawn on the cover, like with beautiful pencil art, photorealistic, just stunning stuff.
Whereas the Voyager ones were pretty, but they looked more like sort of Android screensaver images or something. Like they were all just pictures of the ship in various coloured nebulas.
Yeah, that's it exactly. It's like this theme is red, the next one is green.
Yeah. A blue episode.
A blue episode. I don't know what that represents.
Although to be fair, you might as well just characterize most Voyager episodes that way.
They are all very blue. But after Deep Space Nine ended, so that's 1999, I'm about 12 years old, they start releasing the original series on VHS. And I remember the only episode of the original series I had seen before that was, and again, this is another thing that dates me, pre-streaming era, terrestrial television, syndication, all that sort of stuff. The original Star Trek wasn't still in circulation in the 1990s, at least not in Irish and British markets. So the first episode of Star Trek, the original Star Trek I ever saw, was The Savage Curtain, and I remember that because it won some sort of telephone poll on Sky TV, where they aired like the UK's favorite episode of each of the 4 shows and its favorite Star Trek episode ever. I think the favorite episode ever was Family from The Next Generation, which is a lovely pick.
Oh, interesting.
But it always stayed with me that the one that apparently the UK picked to represent the original Star Trek was the one where Abraham Lincoln and Kirk team up to fight Genghis Khan, a Klingon, for the entertainment of a rock monster.
Yeah. I feel like there was already a certain Futurama sensibility creeping into the fandom at this point.
Yeah. 79 episodes, about 20 good ones. But
Yeah.
I remember the VHS releases. The cassettes I got were when they came out in sets of 3 episodes each, which again gives you that sense of them not being entirely certain that these would sell like hotcakes. Because, you know, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager all packaged 2 episodes each. The original series packaged 3 episodes each, which kind of gave the sense of, well, this way then people will justify spending money on it, because there's 1 in 3 chance that they'll get a classic as opposed to whatever.
Yeah. Even though those episodes are mostly a bit longer.
Yeah, that's it exactly. Even longer. And I remember them coming with like customizable cards as well to make them more like saleable, more collectible. And I remember them coming with like pre-recorded introductions from the cast, which was incredibly charming. thing, where you'd have like Walter Koenig talk about the 3 episodes that were on the cassette, or you'd have George Takei. You'd never get Shatner. Nimoy did quite a few of them as well, which was very lovely. And I remember, and I think even Doohan might have done some shortly before he passed as well. And just like that was my way of getting to know these characters and this show. And again, just watching it chronologically through VHS cassettes, which was again a very interesting artifact as a kid. And again, this is how nerdy it is, tying back to the official Star Trek magazine that you mentioned. I remember that they would run reviews of those cassettes before they would release, and they would give star ratings to episodes. And that is how I would know which episodes I should be paying attention for. That is how I would know that Errand of Mercy was an important episode, or Balance of Terror was an important episode, etc. And that I could, like, that Operation Annihilate wasn't as good, or that I could skip the alternate factor or whatever, was because they had low star ratings. It's kind of interesting how that, like, fan knowledge gets kind of passed down and perpetuated. But yeah, that's how I came to the original Star Trek.
It's interesting that you're coming to it a little bit later in your life, just enough to make a bit of a difference.
12. I like that. I'm already past my peak.
Yeah. No. Well, all I mean by that is you would have been a relatively more sophisticated viewer than me innately, because for me TOS is quite an early childhood thing, and it is those videos, but it's a little bit earlier. So my dad had probably, I imagine it wasn't like maybe very tail end of the 80s, but I'm thinking like very beginning of the 90s when I was 5 and my brother was even younger. And we started to get them then, and we didn't have all of them. And this is actually something I realised only relatively recently, which sounds weird. Because I read so much about it, because I read the Star Trek Encyclopedia, because I read the Fact Files, because I read the Star Trek Companion, which has even more of that behind-the-scenes stuff you're talking about. Yeah. I knew all the episodes. I knew what they were. I felt like I'd seen them. I don't think I had. I think I'd probably seen about... I'm not saying I've seen few of them, but I think I'd probably seen about 79 of the original series run. Yeah. I'd probably seen about 40 of them, something like that. Because I'm just thinking we didn't have that many cassettes, you know. So eventually we had all of TNG, mostly tapes off the telly on tape, but we never had all of TOS. I had those, you know, again those like gaudy covers with like, you know, the immunity syndrome, you know, the giant amoeba from the immunity syndrome and the ship flying towards it. And I should say that because of my younger age, a lot of my favourite TOS episodes were the monster ones, you know, and a lot of it is monster B-movie kind of, you know, as a lot of people point out, you know, it's often a sort of kid's first horror show almost in some respects. I was obsessed with the vampire cloud from Obsession. Like I used to actually, whenever I'd see like a steam vent or something like that, you know, like in real life, I'd be like telling my friends that was a vampire cloud. They probably thought it was nuts.
That's just like the first of 2 Moby Dick like riff-offs in like that space of 5 episodes. It's like they do that, and then they do Doomsday Machine, or they do Doomsday Machine, they do that, and I love the idea that like they were just passing around Moby Dick in the writers' room. We're like, yeah, this'll do.
Anyone not read this yet?
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing. I also love the Doomsday Machine. I should say.
It's a masterpiece. The Doomsday Machine is like Obsession is a fascinating artifact, but the Doomsday Machine is a masterpiece. I love the Immunity Syndrome. The Immunity Syndrome is like low key one of my favorite Star Trek episodes.
It's really good. I think I've read your review of that, and I'll post a link in the show notes. I guess the point I was trying to make was TOS is kind of a first drama show for me in a lot of ways, and I've actually talked to my brother about this because, you know, his kid has just turned 5, and I'm looking forward to watching some of this with him. And I think there's something about TOS for kids who watched Star Trek in the 60s and 70s and stuff, but, you know, later, there's something of a my first drama show about it in the sense that it's primary coloured, it's often loud, it's got music cues that are very obvious and point you in the right directions of ways to react to it. It's got actors who are often going very big.
Shatner's performance, yes, which I love. I think Shatner's performance is amazing, but it is very much, you know, what you're supposed to feel when you watch Shatner.
Exactly, and you know what McCoy is, you know what Spock is, you know what the characters are going to do in any given situation, and as people have pointed out, you know, you're essentially watching, you know, a bunch of friends in space as well. Yeah. There's a sort of collegiate feeling about it, which was also a big part of the appeal for me. But then when you go a bit further forward, and I'm just that little bit older, and a bit like you, I'm watching DS9, and that's kind of my discovery. That's kind of my Star Trek. You know, it's cool to me at the age of 8 and 9. You know, it feels sophisticated. I'm watching something like Duet in season 1 of DS9, and that's I've mentioned that on other episodes of this podcast. That's probably the first sort of serious bit of drama I've ever watched, really.
Yeah,
you know,
which is a Holocaust drama. Like it's a 2-person Holocaust play in Star Trek, which is kind of incredible.
The breakdown of the actor playing, you know, the Eamon Maritza character in Duet can still make me cry. I can watch that in isolation on YouTube.
Harris Yulin, who's stunning. Like, he's one of the great American actors, and he's in this very silly, like, you know, very objectively very silly alien makeup, and he's giving this performance like you're watching a stage. It's stunning.
Yeah, no, it's amazing, and I also think partly based on Duet, and also her beauty. I think I'm still a little bit in love with Nana Visitor, which is very understandable. But it was partly because she was. Well, I still think Kira's one of the best characters in the entire franchise, but and played so well. But I'm getting away from the topic a little bit. But what I mean is that Star Trek for me during the 90s and during this period we're talking about, in a series of incremental steps, kind of taught me to a certain extent what good TV could be.
Yeah.
And what good drama could be, and kind of what a lot of these adult concepts were. You touched there on sort of Holocaust dramas, and so much of DS9 is linked to quite sophisticated topics of adult trauma and sort of civilizational trauma and imperialism and stuff like that. And bits of the original series touch on that. I'm not, I'm not. TOS is often a much pulpier show and painted in broader colours and stuff, but there's certainly serious stuff in there. And I think I can't overestimate how much Star Trek was basically transition into adulthood training wheels for me, like for quite a long period. I'd say for the entire 1990s, really.
Oh, absolutely. And again, the thing is, like, I go back to the franchise. I've written about the franchise extensively, probably far too much. But you go back to it, and like every time you go back to it, there's always more to unpack about, like, not just what it is, what it's saying, but also like how it exists in a cultural context. Like, one of the things I loved about going back to the original Star Trek to write about it was like delving into like contemporary 60s culture and grasping like, oh, so that's why all these shows are about evil machines. It's because automation is coming and people are worried about losing their jobs. Or like, oh, that's why like there's all these shows about psychopathic children who can warp reality in like, obviously like the Trelane character in The Squire of Gothos, Charlie X, for example, Miri, like this constant stream of stories about planets where kids are just running wild. And I'm like being able to go, well, actually reading a bunch of like contemporary reports from the 60s, this is just a mood.
Yeah. That's why The Way to Eden exists.
Yeah, and I mean, not only that, And the Children Shall Lead in the same season as well, in case you don't get the subtext. But like that's the thing where I think you're right that like Deep Space Nine is this incredibly well written, at times very again, and the Next Generation is as well very stagey. There's a reason why actors like I think Stewart and Brooks work very well in Star Trek, and I would argue Shatner as well. It's very stagey. It's very larger than life. Again, like there are particulars of TV as a medium through its history where like you couldn't be sure that people would be watching on a color set, but you also couldn't be sure that they'd be watching in any definition where they could make out what was happening on screen. So as a tendency, television acting tended to be more theatrical, where you were playing as loud as you can in order to reach the cheapest possible seats, so that even if they could only see half your face through static, they would still get the emotion. But I think that like the original Star Trek to me endures as a set of vibes. Like it is most interesting as a kind of a prism into what seemed to be circulating through like 60s pop culture and consciousness, and like things that necessarily weren't being articulated, though some of them very clearly were. Like it's very obvious that, say, A Taste of Armageddon is about Vietnam. Like Gene L. Kuhn has talked about how he was inspired by watching the reports of the Vietnam War on television to write like A Taste of Armageddon. But it's other things like, say, you're watching Operation Annihilate, or even The Doomsday Machine, or even like the Immunity Syndrome, where the inciting incident there is that Spock hears a psychic scream of agony across the cosmos. But there is this kind of almost Lovecraftian idea, and this is maybe a nice segue into talking about the novel, which has certain Lovecraftian tendencies as well. But there's this idea of like collective insanity, which, if you watch media around the 60s, if you listen to people talk about the 60s, if you look at, say, even like 90s debates about the 60s, because there was a lot of stuff with the Clinton White House and stuff like that. Obviously, like Forrest Gump winning Best Picture. There was a lot of debating of the legacy of the 1960s. There is this sense that like America was on the verge of collapse, that America was on the verge of imploding, that at any given moment the country might suddenly tear itself apart, something might spark the tinderbox and everything would blow up. And you're watching Star Trek, and again, this is the one of the things I find fascinating about long-running franchises, in particular, in general, and Star Trek in particular, is the gulf that exists between how we remember a thing and then like actually going back and watching a thing. The most obvious example is like Kirk as a lady killer, which is just the stereotypical portrayal of Kirk. It's there in like Chris Pine's portrayal in the 2009 movies. It's there in, I mean, even arguably like Paul Wesley's version in Strange New Worlds plays into it as well.
And Zach Brannigan as well.
And Zach Brannigan very obviously as well. And like Shatner himself does a lot to perpetuate that. But it's like you go back and you watch the show, and in the first 2 seasons, Kirk's like a very thoughtful nerd. He's a stack of books with legs. Like he's this weird little figure, and it's only when Fred Friedberger comes along that he's like, maybe our character should hook up every once in a while, because, and I'm actually quoting here, because he believed this would convince women to watch Star Trek. What if there was romance in the show that would help them get that demographic they sorely needed?
I think Leonard Nimoy had already sorted that out for them.
yeah. But again, you'll notice in the 3rd season as well, Spock suddenly becomes a lot sexier as well. But like this idea that what Kirk actually was in the show has been retroactively colored by Shatner's myth making and by like the Wrath of Khan and all this sort of stuff. So we retroactively apply it. And even things like Star Trek itself, where Roddenberry kind of like has a come to Jesus moment in the 70s where he kind of embraces radical utopianism. Like, I don't know if you've read the novelization of Star Trek the Motion Picture written by Gene Roddenberry.
I've not, but I think I've read a little bit about it. Is this the one where you've got people lounging around with like leopards walking around Federation headquarters and things like that?
And the fact that Kirk was named for his mother's first love instructor. And like
no, I have read that. Yeah, I do remember that.
And there's a chapter which is just fantastic, which is Kirk, like when Elia comes back, like reprogrammed by V'ger. In the novel, there's an entire chapter of Kirk's inner monologue where he's like, should Decker seduce her or should I? She has a previous emotional attachment to Decker, but on the other hand, I'm probably better in bed. Like there's this fascinating like glimpse into Gene Roddenberry's mind. But obviously, like Star Trek goes on, it becomes utopian. Like you have that whole thing with the first season of Next Generation, where it is possibly the most communist thing that has ever aired on American television. Where like Riker talks about how they don't even eat meat anymore, or how like Picard like wakes up an 80s yuppie in order to tell him that money doesn't exist. All this sort of stuff that's happening. But like you go back and you watch the actual show, the actual like 1960s Star Trek show, and it's like weirdly paranoid. Like, I honestly wouldn't describe it as utopian until you get into the 3rd season. Like, it's this universe that is populated by, like, dead societies. All these as you said, dead worlds populated by monsters that have been, like, annihilated and consumed. And, like...
It's a very haunted universe, and it's a very... it's haunted by the very old. And this is another good time to First Strike. You know, the sort of revenants, right? You know, these horrors that are coming back or have been long suppressed or are long dead. I mean, even something like The Guardian of Forever...
Yes.
Which is seemingly benevolent. I thought The Guardian of Forever was pretty scary. You know, it's a sinister
he seems like he's gone
kind
insane.
Of
thing. Like he seems like he's just been on his own for so long. He's gone nuts. It's like, would you like to alter the course of history? I just like talking to you. Come in and alter the course of history.
It's like Stargate crossed with the HAL 9000. You know?
Pretty much. Like it's like I'm so lonely. I don't care if you destroy the space-time continuum. Just use me.
Yeah. And then, well, you know, you've also got, you know, I will definitely get back to this, obviously, talking about this book, you've got, you know, Apollo showing up.
But that's because, again, it's this, and again, you'll notice most of those are European coded. Trelane is a count and a squire. Apollo is obviously, like, a Greek god. Like, this is very much, it's a show in the wake of the Second World War about America, you know, not to put too fine a point on it, America looking out at a world that is currently, like, smoldering ruins. And, you know, not to be too flippant or dismissive about it, going, finally we get to have an empire, and this is what we inherit. It's like, finally we are a world power. Finally we get to shape the geopolitics of our time, and there's nothing left. Like, all the good stuff has been taken. We've been beaten to the punch. And, like, there is, I think, like, is it Elle Sandifer who writes it, like, Eruditorum Press? She did a really great project on kind of on Doctor Who, charting its history across time, and she's checked in with Star Trek as she goes. Would wholeheartedly recommend checking those articles. She makes the very astute observation that, like, you watch the original Star Trek in the 60s, and it is this very benign American fantasy of empire. And there is this sense of, like, well, what if the future is American? But also, what is there left out there for America to claim? Like, it's really... and I don't think the original Star Trek is that much of a utopia, despite how much fans seize on the idea that Star Trek is a fundamentally utopian franchise.
I think one thing that the original Star Trek reminds me of a little bit is, with maybe like arguably more admirable characters, or at least they're trying to make them more admirable, is something a bit like Gulliver's Travels.
Yeah.
Because it's basically island hopping in this very strange universe where you're about to meet some monstrous or maniacal tyrant, who's going to tell you, who's going to be master of their own little private kingdom, and you're going to be hostage there for a little bit.
All of whom are completely insane. Like, Jack the Ripper at one stage hops into Scotty and then into the Enterprise's computer. There's a moment where the Enterprise is turned into, like, a Christmas ornament and dangled over a flame. Like, I love this stuff, but it's fascinating how completely bizarre and random. And again, like, episodes like that written by Robert Bloch, who was, like, a Lovecraft apprentice. There is this, Is There in Truth No Beauty, which is about an alien so bizarre that to even look upon it is to go mad. Like,
oh yeah, I remember that. It lives in a box, right?
It lives in a box. Like, it's a really great episode, and has Diana Muldaur, who obviously goes on to be Pulaski on Star Trek The Next Generation. She plays the blind woman who is, like, the companion to this creature. Like, it is so bizarre, and I mean that in the most wonderful sort of way, in a way that, like, later Star Trek kind of isn't. Later Star Trek is much more rational. Even when something like the crystalline entity comes along, there's still an attempt to, like, explain it.
Yeah, although that does seem more like a thing that could be in TOS, doesn't it? The crystalline entity is almost like a limit case,
Yeah, it is a limit case, and then it kind of, you get to a point where they shatter it. Like, it's like the crystalline entity isn't really that big a deal in the grand scheme of things. The worst thing is a grieving mother. But, like, that is, like, that is the there is a clear difference between Star Trek, the original series, as it runs from, 66 through 69, and, like, the Berman era of Star Trek. And not to jump back into the discussion we had at the start, I would argue that there should be a similar difference between, like, that and then whatever we end up with now. I think that it's just organic and natural, and it's just how television works and how storytelling works. That, like, Star Trek The Next Generation should be as different from Strange New Worlds as The Next Generation was from the original Star Trek. And yeah, I mean, like, that's what I love about it. I love that it's such an odd beast. And again, that thing with franchises where everything retroactively gets put into a nice square box. The original Star Trek, when you actually watch it, it's almost indescribable. You can't really... There's no comparable experience to watching that show beginning to end.
Yeah, particularly for when we're so distant from other telly around it.
Yeah.
I think we'll break in a sec, but I just wanted to mention that the other thing that's the original Star Trek reminds me of weirdly is Mad Men. I'm sure it's not an original thought, but I'm a Mad Men fan, and they say that the sort of common sense thing about Mad Men is that and I think it's true, is that it's meant to tell you about the 60s, but it actually tells you a great deal about the mores of, like, the late noughties and the early 2010s, because that's when it's being made. And I think Star Trek's almost like a weird mirror version of that, because it's made in the 60s, obviously, but they're trying to make it about the 23rd century, but obviously it keeps bouncing back into being about the 60s. And even, we talk about vibes, the vibe of, Kirk's character being brought his coffee by his yeoman and everything like that, I mean, it's, in some respects, it is Don Draper in space. It's that kind of, and the sexual politics chime with that quite a lot as well. It's you could argue Mad Men's pretending to have a conscience. And I say that as a fan of Mad Men, but like it's kind of Star Trek is more and more starting to remind me of that kind of, and it's going back to that thing of Star Trek also being ultimately a workplace drama as well, amongst the other things it is. Each episode is a different genre, but the thing that ties it together is the naval/workplace drama.
And like, again, like, Kirk is very much a blue collar like, that's the thing that distinguishes Kirk from Picard. I think Picard becomes kind of the template for the show as it goes on. Obviously, Kirk studied at the academy. He was a stack of books with legs. He's introduced playing chess, all that sort of stuff. But he, like, throughout the show, he's continuously presented as this sort of, like, work-a-day guy. He just does his job and gets on with it. And part of the reality of that is that, like, it's just 60s television, so, like, Kirk just has to shrug off the fact that he was turned into a living puppet or whatever, or that, like, he lost his brother and just has to get on with the rest of his day. But there is that kind of sense of him being a guy who just does this job. This is what he does, and this is all that he is. Whereas, like, you look at somebody like, say, Sisko, or you look at, say, Picard, and part of this is it's in the 90s. Part of it is arguably the fact that Stewart and Brooks are very different actors, but they have this kind of, like, inner life that Kirk in the show doesn't always seem to have. And, like, you point to it being a product of the 60s. this is another thing that I think we miss when we talk about like Star Trek as quote unquote a franchise versus Star Trek as like an actual TV show that aired on American television between 1966 and 1969, which is that like there's this retrospective argument, and I want to be very careful making this, I guess, that like Star Trek is a predominantly liberal and left-leaning franchise, and by and large it is, and a large part of that is because Roddenberry kind of reset the tone when you get to the Next Generation. The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine are definitely much more liberal and left-leaning than a lot of contemporary television. What I think is interesting about the original Star Trek, and kind of gets lost when you lump it into that, is that it's that vibes thing. It is airing in the middle of a political maelstrom, and it is engaging in real time with all these ongoing issues. And you can almost see the show, and obviously part of this is that it's a product of different showrunners, different writers, different script editors, but you can see it in real time trying to figure out how it feels about things that are happening around it. So like I think this is a jumping off point into talking about Invasion. We'll obviously be talking about Friday's Child. So Vietnam is a great example of it, where when fans talk about Star Trek, they tend to go, well, Star Trek was obviously anti-Vietnam. Just look at episodes like Errand of Mercy, for example. That's a very clear deconstruction of Vietnam. Look at episodes like A Taste of Armageddon, which is a condemnation of how Vietnam was covered. Look at, say, The Trouble with Tribbles, which is an episode that spoofs the very idea of the Cold War and realpolitik and all that sort of stuff. And all that stuff is entirely valid. It's entirely correct. But then you also have to weigh against that the fact that you look at episodes like, say, A Private Little War or Friday's Child, which are very firmly pro-Vietnam. They're very much episodes about how it is necessary for Americans to go into these places and assert their rights and like fight against the Klingons to assert Federation influence in space.
Yeah.
And like so much of the show is that, where you can feel an almost push or pull from episode to episode where it's not entirely sure how it feels. So like the kids,
and of course it's a product of several different authors, you know.
That's it exactly. But I mean, even say Gene L. Kuhn. Like Gene L. Kuhn wrote, like he has a script credit on A Private Little War and Errand of Mercy, which are two episodes that seem completely diametrically opposed to one another in terms of like the idea of the Federation, the Klingons waging proxy wars on these planets. And like what the correct outcome of that is. Now I know the obvious answer is that like Kuhn was booted off the show and Gene Roddenberry is co-author on A Private Little War, and that's maybe why A Private Little War leans the way that it does. Roddenberry also, I believe, wrote The Omega Glory, in which they explicitly invoke Vietnam and use all sorts of uncomfortable racial slurs as well in this battle against the Yangs and the Coms.
Oh, that one, yeah.
that one, yeah. That my favorite quote unquote favorite fact about that episode, which is maybe the worst episode of Star Trek ever produced, is that Roddenberry, that was like Roddenberry's baby. That second season episode, late second season episode, was like Roddenberry's passion project. That was the one inside him he had to get out. That was his original pitch for the pilot, and NBC said no. No, you're not making that. And he held on to it so long that it got to the end of the second season. I think it's the last two episodes when the show was about to be cancelled. And like one of them, Roddenberry's like, well, what if I make like a pilot for a spin-off that'll be set on Earth starring Gary Seven? And what if we just devote the episode to setting up that so I can have a nice little golden parachute and NBC can commission that drama? But on the other hand, I really have this script that I think we should work on. And they're like, Gene, did you just cross out the date on that from like 1964 to 1967? It's like, no.
Yeah.
You
know, I recently went to a screening in London of Glen or Glenda, and I'd never seen it before.
Oh.
Do you think Gene Roddenberry ever met Ed Wood? Because I think they would have had a fascinating conversation. Because they strike me as two men with... I mean, obviously, Gene Roddenberry had much more commercial success, eventually, or sometimes. But has had a bigger cultural footprint in that sense. But they both strike me as men, very unusual men with very odd sort of mercenary instincts, which are wrong at least as much as they're right.
Yeah, who just happen to latch on to the right thing culturally to be remembered. Roddenberry having the good fortune to do it within his lifetime, and Wood kind of like having to be discovered afterwards. But yeah, it is an interesting category. I think Roddenberry got very lucky in that he picked a bunch of very talented collaborators, Fontana, Gene L. Kuhn, Meredith Lucas even. Like, I think Meredith Lucas is sorely underrated when it comes to, like, discussing the original Star Trek, where, like, Roddenberry goes off and makes, is it Robin Hood? He comes back and he's like, what the fuck have you done with my show, Gene? It's like, what are you're doing? I think the exact argument, the point that broke, like, Roddenberry and Kuhn's relationship was the fact that Kuhn did comedy. Like, Kuhn did, like, I, Mud and The Trouble with Tribbles. And Roddenberry was like, this is meant to be a serious show for serious people about serious things. And so he boots Kuhn off. And I love that, like, Meredith just kind of comes in, John Meredith Lucas comes in, and he's like, I guess I can run this show for 10 episodes, like, off the seat of my pants. And, like, produces these episodes that are incredibly variable in quality, but are kind of, like, gonzo, and some of them work incredibly well. Like, he's, I think, responsible for commissioning Kuhn to write a piece of the action, which is the famous gangster script. He does the Immunity Syndrome, which is the one that I love. He does the Game of Triskelion, which is not a good episode, but is, like, one of those episodes that you remember. Like, I remember that being one of the first...
one of my favorites as a kid, by the way.
And like, a Futurama and Simpsons touchstone, which is how I knew that episode through the Simpsons episode, where it's like, I'll wager was it 30 Quatloos on the newcomer. And the fact that I think Futurama does, like, the brains in Futurama are a direct homage to it. But, like, I think Roddenberry got very, very lucky in that he managed to surround himself with very talented people who, for the most part, were smart enough to be able to talk him down from his worst impulses.
No, it's kind of fascinating that we have Star Trek at all, really. I mean, as with a lot of these shows that go on to become cultural touchstones, you know, people talk about how unlikely Doctor Who is as a thing, and Star Trek's kind of right up there, you know.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, it didn't even hit the 100 episodes for syndication. Like, logically, it should not have been the hit in syndication that it was, because it should have been difficult to package. But it's incredible. And again, that's that generational thing, where you have a wave of kids who watch this in syndication, and who end up kind of writing for it. Like, again, like, earlier we were talking about fans and their ideas of what the franchise is. Like, I find it fascinating that so many of the key Berman-era writers, like Ronald D. Moore or Manny Coto, for example, like, all came to Star Trek not through watching it in the 60s when it was on television because they were too young, but, like, watching it in syndication, like, coming home from school and experiencing it as we did as kids, and being like, this is cool. This is, like, we should do more of this. There should be more stuff like this in the world, and, like, trying to kind of put their own stamp on it. Like, it's just really interesting how that works.
It is, and you know that's a good place to break, because I could talk to you about this all night. let's try and do an episode, and we'll talk. That's all. That's going in the episode. That's all going in the episode. Let's take a couple of minutes break, and then we'll come back and talk about the novel First Strike.
My children, long have I waited for this moment. The memories you bring of your lush and beautiful earth, green fields and blue skies, the simple shepherds and their flocks.
You know of Earth? You've been there?
Once I stretched out my hand, and earth trembled, and I breathed upon it, and spring returned.
You mentioned Agamemnon, Hector, Odysseus. How do you know about them?
Search your most distant memories, those of the thousands of years past, and I am there. Your fathers knew me, and your fathers' fathers. I am Apollo.
And I am the Tsar of all the Russias.
That's a check.
I'm sorry, Captain. I never met a god before.
And you haven't yet. Greetings, Doctor.
Simple humanoid, Captain.
Evidently not so simple.
Welcome back. So, Darren, we are genuinely just about to talk about First Strike, but just as a little prelude into that, and on topic, roughly, I just wanted to get into something that you're intriguing me with on the messages before we were recording this, when you were arranging this episode, because the thing we've come to talk to you about now is a Star Trek novel published in 1996. But you were sort of suggesting in the messaging that you have a bit of a different, and I think broader experience of the Star Trek novel tie-ins than I do. I just wondered if you wanted to tell the listeners a little bit about that, about kind of, you know, how into the books you were and where that started and where it left off as well, I suppose.
As we kind of mentioned, I would have came of age around the same time you did. Would have been a big fan of kind of 90s Star Trek, and I think what I remember is trying various books around the 90s. Some of them were better than others. Some of them I liked, some of them I wasn't a huge fan of. And I think the ones that kind of always drew me were the ones that were more character driven. So like I remember the release of Mosaic. I have like a big hardback version of Jerry Taylor's Mosaic, which is basically her backstory for Janeway. It's a book-length autobiography of Catherine Janeway as written by Jerry Taylor, for whom Janeway's, really been her kind of pet character. I also have, I think, Pathways, which is where she does the same thing for the rest of the Voyager cast as well. And I remember being a huge fan of, I believe it was around about 2000, 2001, Andrew Robinson's A Stitch in Time.
I was going to ask you just next if you've ever read that, because I've not been... Garrick is one of my favourite characters in the whole franchise, which makes me quite common, but also I've never read A Stitch in Time.
A Stitch in Time is a masterpiece. It's one of the best tie-in books ever written, I would argue, like in terms of like mass media that I've experienced. It's based on Robinson's backstory of Garrick that he wrote while he was playing the character. And basically he tells that story. He writes it incorporating like what the writers added as well, and crafts this biography that gives you this idea of this rich inner life of Elam Garrick. Obviously, like it references things like The Wire, a backstory that was suggested by stories like Improbable Cause, Pale Moonlight, In Purgatory's Shadow, but it kind of ties it all together in a very personal way that, again, it's an autobiography of a fictional character, and that is what I always kind of responded to in these tie-in novels. Like I was always... If you're writing for a franchise like this, for me, if you're writing tie-in novels, you should be taking advantage of the opportunities that novels have that television or film don't. In particular, this interiority and this access to a character's inner life, their personality, their wants, their desires, their history, and the kind of sense of scope that you have in a novel that you can't always convey on screen, even allowing for like editing and budget and all that sort of stuff. And I wrote reviews of most of the Star Trek television franchise, and I will put my hands up and say shamelessly that I was inspired in part by, again, Al Sandifer's work on TARDIS Eruditorum, which was an attempt to chart like the history of the Doctor Who franchise across 50-odd years of history and growing as she was writing it. And she would take a look at, like, she'd check in on, like, tie-in materials, so, like, comics, books, audio dramas, other TV appearances, other shows that were similar. And at one stage, I thought it would be fun to try and do that with Star Trek, to try and chart a history of the Star Trek franchise across its various forms. And in particular, like, what happened in the gap between the end of Star Trek in 1969 with the Turnabout Intruder several weeks before the moon landing, and the eventual materialization of Star Trek the Motion Picture like a decade later in 1979. And obviously you have the animated TV show in there. There are a string of comics as well. But like what I was really drawn to were the novels. And like it was going back for that project that I mentioned there, going back writing about the show, delving into its history and the context of it. The novels were really eye-opening because they're kind of an interesting window into fandom.
Because the novels started quite early, didn't they?
They did indeed. They started with, I think it was Bantam Publishers, and they were initially, they're written by James Blish, who was a science fiction writer, and they were basically, you buy the books and it would have three, again, like the cassette tapes, it would have three adaptations of classic Star Trek stories. And obviously this is before VHSs existed, so this was a great way to get circulation of these. If you wanted to have a copy that you could keep of Errand of Mercy, you could buy the book that would have three short stories, one of which would be Errand of Mercy.
All right, so these were almost like the Target books in Doctor Who fandom, that kind of the equivalent kind of space.
Yes, but also like hyper compressed, like to the point that they're just labeled like Star Trek 1 through 12, and like Mudd's Angels, I think, collects the two Mudd stories and an original novella as well to round out the three. And basically Bantam then move on to doing like original stories. It could, again, Blish gets the first like shot at this, Spock Must Die, which is an absolutely insane novel. As the title Spock Must Die with an exclamation mark implies, but it's basically like it becomes this thing that I like about these early tie-in novels that exist like just after the show's gone off the air and where nobody thinks there's going to be any Star Trek ever again. So it's like all that Star Trek is, was, and ever will be is on television. We can do whatever we want with the IP or the property or the franchise. As much Star Trek exists as ever will. Nothing will ever contradict whatever exists already, so we can just add whatever we want to it. And like Spock Must Die is the first like prestige exploration of the transporter. It's the first, like, immediately after Star Trek kind of ends, you have this novel which is like, what are the metaphysics of the transporter? When you get in and you are like transported, does that mean that your body is destroyed and then a photocopy is made at the location? And what happens if the process goes wrong and you are left with a situation where instead of like destroying the original kind of survives? What does that represent? And like, I read it as part of this kind of like delving into the history of Star Trek, and it's fascinating because it's so unformed. It makes no sense with any future episodes or stories using the transporter, because why would it? But it's also kind of like balls to the wall. I must write this stuff. This stuff is interesting. I have these thoughts about it. And as you go on, you start seeing stuff like, say, David Gerald, who like wrote for the show. He wrote obviously like Trouble with Tribbles. He worked on the Cloudminders, various other episodes as well. But he writes like The Galactic Whirlpool, which is a story that he pitched for the show that was too expensive and too high concept to ever make it onto television, where you have this idea of a generational ship that is stuck in like a gravity well of a black hole. So the back of the ship is aging slower than the front of the ship. So more generations grow at the top of the ship than at the bottom of the ship. And you have this kind
This is sounding very familiar to mid-2010s Doctor Who fans, I'd imagine.
It absolutely is. It is very much World Enough in Time. I was watching World Enough in Time and I was like, I wonder if Stephen Moffat read some like 1970s Star Trek fan books. But like, then, obviously, after Bantam lose the rights, they go to Pocket Books. And they go to Pocket Books because Pocket Books, I believe at the time, are another subsidiary of Gulf and Western. So don't worry, media monopolies are not just a new experience. Gulf and Western own Paramount, they own Pocket Books. It's a deal made in heaven. And what's really interesting about those is they start publishing around the time the motion picture comes out. I think the motion picture is the first Pocket Books novelization. But they start hiring writers who are like fans of the show, and in particular would have had like backgrounds in fanzine writing. And this is, I don't know how nerdy you get on this podcast, I apologize.
Pretty nerdy.
Okay, so transformative and curative fandoms, where like curative fandom is the stereotypically masculine idea of like making lists and like documenting stuff. It's the encyclopedias, the Ex Atra Scientia, all this sort of stuff about like cataloging a franchise and cataloging facts about it, and you know, putting them into databases. The people like us who collect Star Trek fact files, that's kind of curative fandom. And then transformative fandom is like people who write fan fiction, do fan art, and like find ways within the franchise to do new and interesting things, or to bring their own interests, or to alter the original text in a way that makes it, you know, different and kind of more inclusive maybe, and kind of incorporating different viewpoints, particularly like, you know, queer writers, women, people of color who wouldn't necessarily have seen a lot of themselves reflected in the reality of Star Trek. And it's very telling, for example, that the first like actual novelization from Pocket Books after the motion picture was Vonda N. McIntyre's The M0vie Effect, which is the novelization that gives Sulu his first name, Hikaru Sulu. Which is like that's what these novels were doing. They were looking at the original Star Trek and going, okay, but what did you miss? What wasn't included there? What people didn't see themselves on screen? Why didn't you give Sulu a first name? Why doesn't Uhura have a first name? What are their backstories? What are their interests? And who are they? And while this is happening, these novels have this like really experimental kind of attitude to them, where they will try anything. And will do things that were impossible to do on screen. So, for example, the most obvious thing is they start like writing from the perspectives of alien cultures, where you have John M. Ford's The Final Reflection, which is, for my money, one of the great Star Trek novels ever written, where he writes about the Klingon culture from a Klingon perspective. And obviously it's radically different from what Ronald D. Moore eventually does with them in The Next Generation. He's much more interested in the Klingons as this culture obsessed with game theory, for example. But it's a fascinating read.
Oh, interesting.
You have Diana Duane, I think these novels come out like 1, 2, 3 after each other, but like basically after Final Reflection, Diana Duane writes, I think it's My Enemy, My Ally, which is the story of an anonymous Romulan commander who I think is implied to be like the aunt of the Romulan commander from the Enterprise incident. And it's basically this study of Romulan culture. And she goes on to write what's called the Rianshu series, which I think is 5 separate books, which are basically Star Trek stories from the perspective of the Romulans, looking at a Romulan culture that at the time is radically different from whatever the Next Generation, Deep Space Nine will kind of explore and develop on screen for these cultures. You have more experimental books, like, say, John M. Ford's second Star Trek novel, which is How Much for Just the Planet, which is a musical. It is a Star Trek musical in book form, which is...
No.
Yes. It's insane. Scotty ends up playing a golf match with the Klingons for control of a dilithium mine on a planet where locals communicate exclusively through song. It is...
Well, Darren, this has been great, but I've got to go and read that.
Go and read that book. I wholeheartedly recommend it. There is nothing like it in the world. And you start seeing... Again, more perspectives. You start seeing stuff that a lot of people now would dismiss as fan fiction, like, say, Margaret Wonder Bonanno's Dwellers in the Crucible, for example, which is a none too subtle, like, pretty much a piece of slash fiction, but published by Pocket Books, which is the story of, like, two women, one of whom is human and one of whom is Vulcan. I wonder who that's supposed to remind us of, who are captured by the Romulans and thrown in prison and have to, like, bond with one another in a way that is entirely romantic and, you know, psychosexual. And in case you don't get the subtext, the cover art that depicts this human woman and this Vulcan woman have, like, the floating head of Kirk and Spock above them, just in case you don't get what the novel's really about. And, like, you have this... Even reading novelizations of the movies as they're coming out, there's this interesting conversation taking place in the books with them, where Vonda M. McIntyre, who, like, she wrote a whole bunch of Star Trek books, but she wrote, like, you know, she did The Entry Effect, which was the first proper Star Trek novel under Pocket. She does the novelizations for the Genesis trilogy. And it's really interesting to read those because you can kind of see that she drifts away from those movies as the movies move on. So, like, she opens The Voyage Home with a chapter that is Carol Marcus writing letters to all of the dead scientists from Genesis in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, in a way that feels like it's a writer poking at the idea of how weird it is to go from this incredibly brutal space epic battle to this, like, time travel farce without reconciling with the legacy and consequences of it. And, like, Diane Carey is a great example of this, where, and again, this is a nice way to kind of pivot into talking about Invasion, but, like, Carey is a writer who, she writes historical fiction as well as science fiction. She has a very strong fondness for the original version of Star Trek. Most of her fictional novels are for the original version of Star Trek. She does adaptations of episodes for other installments of the franchise. So she does adaptations of The Search, for example. She did an adaptation of The Way of the Warrior, right?
Oh, I think I would have read both of those, actually.
How much do you remember of those?
I think more about The Way of the Warrior, and I remember The Way of the Warrior has more scenes in that, you know, to do with, like, you know, Worf before he joins the DS9 crew, and more kind of background to that. So I definitely remember they have the equivalent of deleted or author-added scenes in them. Yeah,
and, like, I remember reading them and, like, as a teenager getting the sense that the person writing them didn't really like Deep Space Nine. And my go-to example of this is she wrote the novelization of Broken Bow, which is the pilot for Star Trek Enterprise. And this is, I believe, by the way, this was the last book that Diane Carey wrote for the Star Trek line, and you'll discover why in a moment. In the special features on the first season of the Star Trek Enterprise Blu-ray, and by the way, I wholeheartedly recommend all of the Star Trek Blu-rays. They have fantastic special features. There's a conversation between Braga and Berman talking about, like, launching Star Trek Enterprise. And Braga shares the story of, like, reading the novelization of Broken Bow and, like, talking about reading this novel that had been written by this veteran Star Trek writer who clearly hated every single aspect of the script. Like, I think the line that he quotes, which is possibly one of my favorite lines in any piece of literature ever: "No sane Starfleet captain would have done this, but Jonathan Archer was no ordinary Starfleet captain." And, like, Braga talks about, like, reading this novelization that just seems to hate this script that she's been paid to adapt, and, like, calling the editor at Pocket and having to, like, have that conversation. And, like, it is interesting that, like, a similar thing happens with J.M. Dillard's novelization of Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country, where you're reading that and you're sensing that there's a tension in conversation there, where Dillard very clearly doesn't agree with how the film treats Kirk as a character, its portrayal of Kirk as a flawed character. And so there's a lot of hedging. and a lot of writing and a lot of stuff that tries to excuse. Again, you mentioned author-added stuff, where there's a lot of stuff that tries to excuse the more powerful moments of the film, where Kirk says, like, let them die, or the kind of dinner conversation that they have when they've got Romulan ale, where she just talks about how out of character all these people are and how they'd never talked like this before, and how it just didn't seem right hearing those words come from their lips. And you're like, this feels more editorial than an adaptation.
Yeah. You're sort of reviewing the movie at the same time as writing the novelization.
Yeah. And if we're talking very briefly about, like, the novels, I say, as I've monologued about the novels for God knows how long at this point.
No.
What I love about them is I think the novels are strongest at the points where Star Trek is less dominant on screen. I think, as a rule, when the franchise is ascendant on screen, by necessity, the secondary media, that's comics and novels, become a lot less creative. They become a lot more tightly controlled. They become a lot more tied to what is happening on screen, a lot more kind of, beholden to it, as it were. They stop being creative and they stop being inventive. And, like, that happens when Star Trek The Next Generation comes on. So Richard Arnold, who's, like, one of Gene Roddenberry's yes men, begins pruning the line. He begins, like, saying, no, that's not what a Star Trek novel is. People aren't reading Star Trek novels to encounter, like, he says, no original characters. You shouldn't be introducing new characters. You should only be basing novels around existing characters. You shouldn't be depicting events that don't reference events that we've already seen on screen. They should be more action-driven. They should be more dramatic. I don't want character studies. I don't want to know Uhura's first name. That's not what people read these books for. And you have this generation of writers who were really popular in, like, the late 70s, early 80s. And so, like, Diana Duane, who I mentioned, did the Romulan books. John M. Ford, who did, like, the musical and the Klingon books. Peter David, who is, like, one of my favorite Star Trek authors. He wrote, like, M0vie, for example, and I think Q Squared, and Q in Law.
Oh, Q Squared is well, I'll talk a bit about my experience with the novels in a bit, which is shallower, but Q Squared is involved, put it that way.
Yeah, like, and these books that are adventurous and playful and fun and goofy, and Arnold is just like, no, I don't want to work with these people anymore. Like, to the point where, like, there's this almost 15-year gap in Diana Duane's Rianshu novels that I mentioned. It's these 5-novel series, and she publishes the first 3, and there's, like, a 15-year gap, and then she publishes the final 2. And that 15-year gap is because Richard Arnold was like, we don't want these anymore. These aren't of interest. And then, obviously, so the story goes, when Roddenberry died during the 5th season of The Next Generation, apparently Arnold was told to pack his stuff and escort it off the Paramount lot in the space of an afternoon. It apparently happened that quickly. Yeah, not very well liked was Mr. Arnold, to be entirely frank.
Well, this is like when the old king dies, and they're like, there's a clear out of the court, isn't it? It's like...
So I like those novels. I like those novels that come before The Next Generation, and I like the novels that come after Voyager and Enterprise. I think there's, like, this wonderful renaissance, and again, stuff that you can do in novels that you can't do in kind of film or television, where you start seeing writers who are taking the creative freedom and opportunity, and the fact that, for all intents and purposes, Star Trek is dead. There is no future Star Trek coming. And so there's nothing that will contradict us. We now have the freedom to do whatever we want with these characters and these concepts, so let's go wild. Where you have, like, say, writers like David or George III, who writes novels like, for example, it's the Crucible trilogy, which I think is for the 60th anniversary of Star Trek. Providence of Shadows, what it is. And it's basically this alternate history of, like, what McCoy's life was, both in the timeline of Star Trek as we know it, but also in the timeline where he traveled back in time in the City on the Edge of Forever. And the chapters kind of alternate between the two, where you have this story of, like, what it was like for McCoy to live through the Great Depression versus, like, what it was like for McCoy to deal with the death of his father. Like, for example, all this stuff that is kind of suggested in the show, but is never clearly articulated. The other example I think of are like the Lost Era novels, which, and again, they bring back writers who had worked during the 70s and 80s, like Margaret Wonder Bonanno, for example, Diane Duane, and like Serpents Among the Ruins, which is this story by David or George III, which does this very fan servicey concept of what was the Tobit incident, this incident of like Star Trek continuity, but instead becomes this fascinating character study of like John Harriman, who's this character who appeared for 5 minutes at the start of Star Trek Generations, played by Alan Ruck.
Oh, he's Yeah, he's the Alan Ruck character. Yeah.
And like it becomes this really wonderful character study of like, what is it like to be the one captain of the Enterprise that nobody cares about? And like, what does that mean? What is your place in history where your place in history is to be a footnote and to be erased and forgotten? And these stories are really interesting, really fascinating, really ambitious. I point to things like, say, Una McCormack's The Never-Ending Saga, which is basically, it takes the character from, if you remember the story Cardassians from the second season of Deep Space Nine, the Cardassian who was raised on Bajor and taken home to his parents or his father. It basically tells the story of Deep Space Nine from his perspective. So he goes back to Cardassia, and then it like charts the Obsidian Order, trying to destroy the Dominion, the Dutapa Council taking control, Dukat selling out Cardassia to the Dominion War, the Dominion turning on Cardassia, and becomes this like wonderful generational saga, almost like a Russian novel of the rise and fall of this house on Cardassia, using this character who appeared in one episode of Deep Space Nine. And like, that's the sort of stuff that I love about the novels, and those are the kind of novels that excite and interest me. They're the ones that kind of take advantage of the form to do stuff that you couldn't even do on television regardless of budget, to bring you inside the heads of characters or to explore the events of the shows from different perspectives, to kind of narrativize them, becoming these kind of, again, very, transformative fiction works, which are like, yeah, but what that really was about, what the story of Cardassia really is, what the story of John Harriman really is. That's the stuff that I really, really love. And I guess this is a nice segue into talking about Invasion, because Invasion is not that kind of book at all.
No. Well, different perspectives, different genres as well, like perhaps heretical genres, to the sort of main canon show, because, very briefly, I loved, maybe more of the 90s books than you did, or some of the big, the blockbuster ones, like Federation. Not time for this now, but Federation is one of the books I've read the most in my...
Oh, that's the Reeve Stevens book, yeah?
Exactly, yeah. I mean, that's one of the books as a kid / early adolescent I probably read the most, like I've read that many, many times, an embarrassing amount of times. Vendetta, the one where the Doomsday Machine take on the Borg.
Yeah, it comes back. That's a Peter David book, right?
That's Peter David, yeah. Q Squared is I think, it's been many years since I've read it now, but I think it's genuinely bonkers in terms of what's going on there.
Absolutely. That's Q versus Trelane, right? Isn't it, if I remember correctly?
Yeah. Q versus Trelane across 3 different trippy intersecting timelines and universes. Some of which are moving at different speeds. And stuff.
But again, it's something you could only do in books. Yeah. The things you could only do in books, you could never realize on screen in the franchise. Like, I love that stuff.
Yeah, but a footnote to Invasion, one of my favourite, because I read some of the DS9 novels, I read some of the novelizations, but I actually read, and I believe this is a divisive one in the fandom, but I actually really, really liked Fallen Heroes, the DS9 novel, which is the one by, is it David Abhue? Is that how you say that? And it's one of the fairly early DS9 tie-in novels. It probably comes out about the same time as the...
Sounds familiar.
I think it might come out between the first and second series of DS9. And this was controversial because, very briefly, it's basically incredibly dark. It basically has DS9 being boarded by a dangerous alien species who want a MacGuffin from them, but they are incredibly dangerous. They have I remember the thing of like, instead of having like phasers or disruptors, they have guns. Like, they just have full-on guns that can, get to them, and they basically everyone in the crew, and it gets, it ends up getting timey-wimey reversed at the end, but everyone in the crew gets horribly murdered, and really graphically as well, and in really creative ways. It's like a slasher film, the DS9 thing, really. And I think there's things again you couldn't do in the show, like Odo. Odo goes into the reactor core of the station, which is at like 4,000 degrees Celsius and stuff like that, and he can do that because he's a changeling, and there's all sorts of crazy stuff in it. But because of the horrible deaths of the characters, a lot of people were sort of criticizing that as grimdark Star Trek before I really knew that was a thing. But I liked it because of the dark tone, because I was exactly the right age to be like, oh my god, you wouldn't see this on TV. This is crazy, like. Well,
I mean, like, I remember the and I've reread it for the project that I did. It's the 34th Rule, which is the one I believe that like Armin Shimmerman wrote with David Orr George III. And it's a really fascinating concept, but it has the Bajorans like setting up concentration camps for the Ferengi on Bajor.
Okay.
I think it's because the Grand Nagus refuses to sell back the orb that from obviously of all things the quirky comedy episode Profits and Loss. But I believe it is like the Grand Nagus refuses to give them back the orb, so they basically enact all this stuff, and it becomes this interesting meditation on the Ferengi and the Bajorans as two very different Jewish stereotypes in the larger Star Trek franchise. It's a very interesting meta-textual kind of commentary. Shimerman's obviously a very he's a member of SAG. He's been I think one of the leaders of SAG. He's a very thoughtful person who has put a lot of thought into stuff. But it's like, you're reading it and you're like, Quark in a concentration camp on Bajor. It's got like that's the sort of stuff I find fascinating, even though you're like, there's no way that anybody would get away with doing this on the franchise on television. There is no way you could do this. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up Jewish coded outcast characters as well, because in our continual and perhaps eternal dance around First Strike without talking about First Strike, that's also a thing.
That's the first rule of First Strike.
Is this the voice of God? One voice, many faces. Does this better suit your expectations? It is I. The journey you undertook to reach me could not have been an easy one.
It was not. The barrier stood between us, but we breached it.
Magnificent. You are the first to find me.
We sought only your infinite wisdom.
And how did you breach the barrier?
With a starship.
This starship. Could it carry my wisdom beyond the barrier?
It could, yes.
Then I shall make use of this starship.
It will be your chariot.
Excuse me.
It will carry my power to every corner of creation.
Excuse me, I'd just like to ask a question. What does God need with a starship?
Bring the ship closer.
I said, what does God need with a starship? Jim, what are you doing? I'm asking you a question.
Who is this creature?
Who am I? Don't you know? Aren't you God?
He has his doubts.
You doubt me?
I seek proof. Jim, you don't ask the Almighty for his ID.
Okay, so First Strike. Here we go. So First Strike by the aforementioned Diane Carey came out in '96, and it's part of this crossover event, I guess timed for the 30th anniversary, which features the four kind of iconic crews as they were then: the TOS crew, the TNG crew, the DS9 crew, and the Voyager crew, dealing with this threat. You know, particularly in terms of the TOS and the rest across centuries. You know, they're dealing with this sort of alien threat, but they're doing it in different ways. They're arguably doing it in different sort of genre types. You know, and we're specifically going to try and talk about the first book, First Strike, which features Kirk and the original Enterprise crew taking on an alien menace called the Furies. Now, where to start with this one, says the person who should be the organised podcast host. Well, we've obviously been dancing around it and avoiding starting for a while. Now, I want to... this is a little bit like the conversation we had about the TV show. I'm reading a lot then. I'm a very bookish kid, you know, I'm a bookworm in the 90s. I'm always glued to a book, you know, particularly when we're on glamorous family holidays where I should be looking at, you know, the nice scenery and stuff. I've always got my head in a book. But I'm reading a lot of stuff designed for kids. I'm starting to read a bit more adult sort of stuff. You know, I'm starting to find my way into more adult fiction and young adult fiction and things like that. In '96, I'm sort of starting to grapple with different concepts and different genres, I guess. But I am doing that partly through pulp fiction and through tie-in novelizations and, you know, through genre fiction that I, you know, are spin-offs and things I love, like Star Trek. this introduced me to concepts and political things and stuff that we can talk about a bit later. But it's also starting to introduce me to sci-fi genre tropes and things that TV hadn't already done, things that they come across. Have you ever read the Arthur C. Clarke book Childhood's End?
I have not. I've heard of it though, and it has a very famous TV adaptation, doesn't it? Or am I getting it mixed up?
They've at least made a TV movie, and they've adapted it on radio, I believe. I'll just say that there's spoilers. There are other things to Childhood's End, but I read Childhood's End. Childhood's End was published in 1953, by the way. I looked it up before the show, and it's one of Arthur C. Clarke's most sort of respected novels, like right up there with like Rendezvous to Rama and obviously 2001 and that kind of thing. But it sort of was his first big splash as well, at least in novel form. And I read that years after First Strike, probably about 5-6 years or even more after First Strike, when I was firmly into my teenage years. But Childhood's End features aliens coming to Earth. There's a kind of a day the Earth stood still kind of thing to it. These sort of paternalistic aliens who at least seem to be looking after us. In some ways, it's actually a bit like almost like a rewrite or a sketch of something like To Serve Man. Where the motives of these aliens are a bit suspect, and it ultimately ends up going in a more arguably utopian direction than something like that. But anyway. So if you don't mind a mild spoiler for a 1953 book...
No, go for it.
Something that happens about a quarter of the way into Childhood's End, because it is quite episodic, there's sort of chapters to it and stages to it. The aliens reveal themselves to the Earth people. The Earth people haven't seen them yet. And the main alien, the sort of benevolent dictator of the new Earth, is revealed to look exactly like Satan. So I know that also comes up in the animated series. The Magics of Megas 2, am I saying that right?
Think so. It's been a while since I've watched the animated series, to be honest.
I think that's the one where they go to the center of the galaxy, and in this version they meet a bunch of people who are based on old Earth mythic archetypes, and one of them's Satan, and he's really, really nice.
Yeah. It's again, it reminds me a lot of the Savage Curtain, the UK's favorite Star Trek episode.
Officially, you're going to keep rubbing that on our faces. We'll never live that down.
Yeah, I mean, I remember it being kind of just in the zeitgeist. Like, again, I was reading it this time and thinking a lot about, say, Doctor Who, where you have episodes like, say, the Daemons from the 1970s, where you have these monsters that look like, kind of, again, classic mythic monsters. But yeah, I think maybe this would have been one of the first examples of it. I don't think I quite glommed on to the idea of it being about devils and demons turning out not to be devils and demons. Because I think that part of it is rather complicated without getting into the politics of it. But yeah, I don't know if it was one of the first instances of it, but I do remember thinking it was fascinating to have, because again, this would have been before I'd watched so much of the original Star Trek, ironically.
Yeah.
But having this idea of the Lovecraftian horror, the spaceship that is like populated by mist and has moss and skulls on it and all this sort of stuff, and druids, and having that intersect with science fiction. That's more the vibe I remember from reading this as like a teenager.
Well, it's making me think, I think we'll get into a load of the original series and arguably later franchise episodes that this are sort of echoed in this or prefigured in this.
Yes.
But I think in the original series alone, we mentioned, was it like Who Mourns for...
Cat's Paw,
Cat's Paw,
Wolf in the Folds, yeah.
Yeah. Well, is it Who Mourns for Adonias? I don't know if I've ever said that out loud, but the Apollo episode.
Yeah.
That's obviously in there. And there's a bunch of things. I mean, actually, one thing we'll do this when we talk about the ending of the book. But there's a couple of TNG episodes that this reminds me of as well. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, what do you? This is a big topic, but what are your impressions now as an adult rereading this of like the Furies as a threat? I guess.
Okay, we're talking about the whole book because it's like I think. Okay.
It's tough, this one, isn't it?
It is a bit tough, this one. Like, I guess this is the thing that I mentioned this while we were chatting about it, while we were messaging about this. And I mentioned as I was reading this, it's like, I suddenly remember having very strong feelings about Diane Carey. It's like I had them when I was younger, when I was reading her books. I was never like, I think she's a very capable, very competent writer. I think she knows how to structure a story. It's very notable that I think, John Ordover, the editor of The Line, he credits the whole invasion concept to Carey. He says, like, look, my contribution to that was writing 4 lines of a pitch, and it was Carey who fleshed that out to, like, a mythology, a backstory, a Bible, and who wrote the first book that provided the basis of this gigantic crossover. And what I remembered about Carey is the sense that in some ways she's a very conservative, old-fashioned kind of writer. She has a view of how things are and how things should be, and like she's, as we mentioned, much more of a fan of the original Star Trek than she is of any of the spin-offs. She has a very strong affection and affinity for James Tiberius Kirk, which I'm sure we'll talk about when we talk about the book. And I remember her getting a lot of like the big high plum books, which meant that I had to read them. Like she got the books that were quote unquote important in terms of the line. So for example, I think around the time the Star Trek First Contact came out, for example, she was the author on Ship of the Line, which was canonically, inverted commas, the first adventure of the Enterprise E. It was the story of the Enterprise E leaving space dock. So I, being the dutiful little nerd that I was like, I have to read this book, and remember finding it like a slightly grueling experience because a lot of it was like this very militaristic, very like hardcore, like very... Again, she has a background in historical fiction. A lot of what's the visceral experience of war, and not in a way that is like war is hell. More like it's kind of exciting and thrilling, isn't it? Yeah. And I think rereading Invasion, what kind of struck me was as I was reading it, there was this kind of creeping dread in the back of my mind with the story of the Furies, who are this alien species that are coming to our galaxy from somewhere far away. Their backstory is that once upon a time, they lived in our galaxy, but they were exiled by some strange threat, the Conquerors, as they're known, and forced to, like, you know, scatter, fragment refugees across the cosmos. And they've come back, and they literally, all they want is to have their home back. That is their motivation here. And I'm reading it and I'm going, this is the mid-90s. Yeah. In particular, this is Star Trek in the mid-90s. There is this big ongoing debate in American pop culture, which is arguably still happening to this day. But it really kind of kicks off in the mid-90s, which is this idea of how does America deal with its own legacy with regards to the fact that its past is maybe not as romantic or as idealized as the frontier myth wants it to be? And again, Star Trek is a frontier myth. It's wagon train to the stars. It's the Old West extrapolated into the distant future. It's manifest destiny. It's all that sort of stuff. And so a key part of like manifest destiny and the myth of the American West is the idea of this dispossessed population, that there was this indigenous population, that America was not quote unquote discovered by Europeans, in that it was already there and already populated. And in order for the America, the American ideal to be founded, the American mythology to take root, that population had to be displaced. And, you know, there's a lot of conversation happening about that in popular culture during the 90s. You have this wave of revisionist Westerns. Dances with Wolves, like, wins the Best Picture Oscar, for example. All that sort of stuff is kind of simmering away in the background. And like, you don't even need to look outside Star Trek to see this kind of debate taking place. In Voyager, in like 1995 and 1996, you know, around the time this book is coming out, you have the Kazon. And the Kazon are like another weird metaphor dealing with this legacy of American original sin, where they were written by like Michael Piller and Jerry Taylor as metaphors for the LA gangs.
Yeah, I didn't. By the way, brief sidebar. I had never thought of the Kazon in that way until I read one of your essays, and I was like that completely changed my rewatching of Voyager in recent years.
Well, I mean, like, it's not even like to put it in context, this is something they acknowledge. If you read, like, any of the making of books of Voyager, the original drafts of Caretaker referred to, like, the Kazon Nistrum as the Crips. Like, it was not subtle. And again, the fact that the second season episode is called Initiations, about a young Kazon having to prove his worth in order to be a member of his quote-unquote sect. And again, like, this is just part of the fabric of what's happening in American culture, particularly in Los Angeles, which is where the entertainment industry is based. You should note that around the same time that Voyager's doing Kazon, Deep Space Nine is introducing the Jem'Hadar, who are these drug-addicted soldiers who are incredibly violent men. And you have the story, I can't remember the name of it, but it's the one with the young Jem'Hadar. Is it The Adversary?
The Abandoned, I believe that is.
The Abandoned. Yeah. I knew it was an A word beginning with the... where it's the story of like a young Jem'Hadar with violent impulses who is just inherently destructive. Now, Deep Space Nine very smartly does not go down the path of treating the Jem'Hadar as a metaphor for young African-American men in gangs. And a large part of that, I want to credit, like, Avery Brooks, who directed The Abandoned, and who has talked, like, quite candidly about how he was very careful in, like, how he directed that episode and how he dealt with the writers in terms of portrayals of, you know, obvious and uncomfortable stereotypes to do with young African-American men. We should note that Voyager did not have somebody like Avery Brooks who was doing that sort of stuff and who was dealing with the production staff. So you have, throughout Voyager in its first 2 seasons, the Kazon are these stand-ins for gang culture in LA, but and the show leans hard into this. The mythology developed by Kenneth Biller and Michael Piller goes into the idea that the Kazon were actually once slaves of the Trabe, who are this very cultured, very much more quote-unquote human-looking aliens who look more civilized and more cultured, who like kept the Kazon as slaves, and then the Kazon got free, and then they basically burnt down the quadrant. And there's this really uncomfortable subtext to episodes like Alliances, where it's like, would the Delta Quadrant be better if the Trabe had never let the Kazon go free? Would this section of the galaxy be nicer if the Kazon had remained slaves? And you're like, Jesus Christ, did nobody working on Voyager think about the subtext? And I bring that up because that feels a little bit like what Invasion is doing with the Furies, where there's this paragraph and speech that Kirk gives later on when it is discovered that the Furies are indeed from this section of the galaxy, that they do indeed provide the basis for human and Klingon kind of like background and, you know, kind of mythology. And Kirk's like, man, it really kind of sucks that we drove these people out of their homes and like forced them into exile, and that they no longer have a place to call their own. But you know what? It's not my fault. Nobody is accountable for the crimes of their ancestors. So, suck it up. Big deal. Deal with it. Cope with it. It's not my fucking problem.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because he does. There is one paragraph that you probably spotted as well, where I think you're quoting parts of it, paraphrasing parts of it there, where he basically says, "I don't believe in reparations." Right? He doesn't use quite those words. But,
yes.
But that's very much, if we're talking about contemporary politics, that's kind of what he is politely disagreeing with. I think it's fascinating because quite a lot of the plot of this book is Kirk and, you know, our noble characters, our heroes, trying to ascertain whether they could be responsible for the plight that these characters find themselves in, whilst also saying that it doesn't matter either way, because they're not.
Yeah, but that's it. Like, the big revelation is that they are responsible, and this causes, like, chaos in the Fury ranks. Like, the hero character, the Virgo of the Wraith, is basically like, look, I don't think you guys are the conquerors. I'm going to put my life on the line. I'm going to stand for you, and I'm going to vouch for you. I don't think you guys are the conquerors. You seem pretty cool. And then it turns out that they were the conquerors, and Kirk is like, well, tough.
And Kirk's been lying to him by omission.
Yeah, pretty much, which is like, I like, and again, I'm reading it, and I'm like, is this the subtext of the book? Is this the subtext? Because part of me is like, maybe this is just a subconscious thing. Maybe this isn't on Kerry's mind. Maybe this is a metaphor she kind of stumbled on accidentally because she wanted to tell a kind of a very Lovecraftian story, a big epic space opera with an ancient evil kind of thing. And then I get to that paragraph that you mentioned where Kirk is quite literally like, yeah, no generation should be held accountable for the actions of their forebears. Sorry. And I'm like, nope, this is not subtext, this is text. And it does feel like it's tied to that debate that was taking place in 90s culture. And again, like, Voyager is weirdly like a hotbed for this sort of stuff because the show itself goes back and forth. Like, Voyager like has episodes like Remember, for example, or like Distant Origin or Living Witness, or arguably even episodes like, say, Course Oblivion, or you could go back to something like Nothing Human, where it's these stories about like memory and guilt and the idea of like legacies of violence and trauma and horror, and the importance of like remembering and acknowledging history and like reconciling with history and accepting history, but also at the same time this kind of tension of but not too much, like not too far. Let's not go crazy here. As you say, it's very much the anti-Ta-Nehisi Coates. This is the case against reparations, which is fascinating.
Well, Kirk also says something like, do you expect, like, was it like 500 billion people to just move or something like that. You know, he sort of, you know, he mocks it on a pragmatic level as well as a moral.
Because there's no middle ground. Yeah, like it's not as if we could sit down and have a conversation and work this stuff out. It's a binary yes or no thing.
Yeah.
And the book is coming to an end, so we need a massive space battle.
Yeah. Well, critiques of Star Trek, or at least just criticism of Star Trek and observation of Star Trek often point out the sort of, I guess it's a bit done to death now, but the sort of thing of like, oh, you know, the Federation, they're not so dislike the Borg, you know. But it struck me on this that the nearest that Kirk comes to, you know, conciliating with the Furies is basically saying, oh, come on in, you can join the Federation. That's fine, you can join the Federation, it'll all be great. Like, you know, it's like, you know, they only learned who the Federation were this morning, you know.
I actually dug out the paragraph here. And now they're back, McCoy said, and we're all here together. Kirk spun to him. But it wasn't them. He gestured as if to point through the bulkheads of the starship to the huge ship flanking them. And it certainly wasn't us. The winning civilization is dead and gone, and all its war crimes are gone with it. I refuse to take responsibility for any action by anyone other than myself or my crew, and I only take on the crews because I'm the commanding officer. We certainly don't owe them anything, and they don't deserve to take what's ours. Times change, history moves along. No one is owed by the children of others. This is as silly as if I went back to some corner of Roman Britain and claimed it as my own because some ancestor of mine owned it 1,000 years ago. I don't buy this collective memory group rights mindset.
Yes.
And like, it really feels like when he says mindset, like Carey initially typed bullshit and then just like erased it.
Yeah.
It's very much like, well, it's in the British Museum now, deal with it.
Well, that's the line that stands out in 2023, particularly as reactionary. I think, you know, it's and there's a bit of a yelp in that direction. I actually like, you know, I don't think I'm necessarily even pushing back here, but I think I like the way. This is a whole other conversation, I guess. I like the way Diane Carey writes Kirk in this, because I quite like the sort of character he is in this, where he is he's kind of aware, you know, while she's obviously seems to very much like Kirk and admire him a great deal. He's also a man who's kind of aware of his darker nature and his more violent nature. You know, you get that in the sort of pitched battle that takes up quite a lot of time when you first introduced him on the planet, on the Capellan's planet. But he's someone who he talks about his responsibility as a starship captain and about the sort of darkness of that responsibility. That doesn't he talk about himself at one point as like and this reminded me of the Abrams movies, as like a hot-headed kid who was essentially given a starship to play around with, you know, and he's aware that this starship is this weapon of war, you know.
Like there's the moment where Zenner's like, look, we can help you deal with the Klingons, and like Carey's like, and Kirk thought about it for a moment.
Yes.
The thing is, like, reading it though, I don't. Okay, I want to be careful about this because I actually do think Carey is functionally a very good writer. I think Carey is a very efficient writer, and I think she's a good writer to choose for a project like this, because this is a story that is primarily about like setting up ground rules. Like, by structural necessity, the Star Trek Invasion tie-in, the original series tie-in, is going to be quite distant from Deep Space Nine, Next Generation, and Voyager. Those are all quite close together chronologically. This has to function as like a prologue and table setting. And Carey, I don't think, does interiority particularly well. That's not her interest. She's very much an action writer, and like, again, you can tell that when you read the book. It like begins by throwing you into the Klingon fleet and gives you this intense like experience of it, and like it throws you into the battle in the wake of Friday's Child and just gives you this intense experience of it. There's no real sense of providing context or background. I don't really feel like I know that much about Kellen, the Klingon commander, who is ostensibly central to this narrative.
Yeah.
It just kind of, it's go, go, go. There's a great moment, and this kind of gives you the sense of like how much Carey kind of centers on Kirk as a character. There's a moment I think about where they visit the Wrath, and they go to what functions as the bridge on it, and they notice the skulls, and McCoy says they're real, and the book doesn't bother to have McCoy explain how he knows that they're real. It doesn't pop into McCoy's subjective experience. It doesn't tell you that he knows this because of his background as a qualified medical expert or because he knows the particulars of it. It just has Kirk think, McCoy knows what he's talking about. He probably saw something on them that indicated it was real, so I'm going to take his word and assume that they're real. Like, it's very much like it is very tightly focused around Kirk and in particular around Kirk as like a man of action rather than a man of like interiority. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's just how Carey writes.
Well, I think you only get, I hadn't really thought about this, but this is interesting, but I think you briefly get Kellen's perspective when you're, in the bits where he's the narrating, like
in the opening act.
In the opening, and maybe slightly later on he's on the ship, sneaking around and stuff. But like I think when amongst our heroes, again, you basically do just get Kirk's perspective, don't you? And there are things like that, like knowledge gaps where he's wondering what Spock is thinking or what McCoy is reacting to and things like that. And it is very Kirk focused. I hadn't really thought about how, in technique terms, it is. You're very much in Kirk's head,
And I mean, and it's very clear that the novel absolutely loves Kirk. We should be clear. The Klingons encounter the Furies, and their first instinct is, we need to go and get Kirk to deal with this crap.
Yeah.
Kirk ends up he meets the Furies, and the Furies end up just loving him so much that they're like, maybe we don't need to invade this galaxy at all, because you're so fucking cool, Kirk.
Yeah.
And then you have the climax of the novel, which is, I'm James Tiberius Kirk, captain of the combined Federation and Klingon fleets.
Yeah.
It's this fascinating, and I don't mean this pejoratively, it's going to sound dismissive, but this wonderful fan fiction of Kirk, where Kirk is the coolest man who ever lived, and he is just fundamentally awesome. There's a wonderful paragraph where Carey seems to briefly consider Kirk as a flawed human being who other people may disagree with. And I mean, obviously Kellen breaks with Kirk at certain points over the course of the narrative, but eventually comes back around to realizing that Kirk really is as cool as he thought Kirk was.
That's his arc. Is his briefly doubting Kirk.
Yeah, he's the doubting Thomas of this novel. But you have that moment where Kirk himself, in the dark twilight of his soul, kind of considers that, maybe he is reckless, maybe he's been foolish. And then McCoy just delivers this monologue about how incredibly awesome Kirk is to Kirk. I'm going to see if I can find it here in my book, because it's just, I remember reading it and just being this is a bit much.
Yeah.
Well, there we go. So
I'm glad you've done some close reading here, Darren. This makes the podcast sound much more classy.
Here we go. McCoy folded his arms and canted his head. That's what's different about you, Captain. Kirk looked at him. About me, I don't follow. Yes, the doctor sighed. No matter how far out we go, or how much space separates us from somebody else, you always see how we're all alike instead of how we're all different. And you talk to strangers as if you've known them a year. That's what sets you apart from me and Spock and all the rest of us.
All the rest of us idiots.
Yeah, pretty much. Even from the other starship captain. Everybody else goes out into space expecting us to see things that are alien and weird. You look at the alien and weird, and you see a piece of us. Basking in the compliment, somewhat embarrassed that there wasn't a veiled insult in there somewhere, Kirk leered at him. You're a frustrated psychoanalyst, McCoy. It's kind of impressive how much this book loves James Tiberius Kirk. And I say that as somebody who loves James Tiberius Kirk.
Yeah.
He truly is the best of us.
Well, can I ask you, I know we're going to jump all over the place here, but I wanted to talk about, while we're talking about Kirk and his relations with the other characters and stuff, do you think, I don't know if you can answer this briefly, is Diane Carey a particularly slashy friendly writer? I'm thinking particularly in terms of obviously the big one, Kirk/Spock.
Yeah, that's it. I don't think so. I think obviously there's stuff in there you can read from a modern perspective where he's so concerned about Spock on the battlefield, and it has this kind of wounded thing. Is it the hurt comfort idea?
Yes, I was just going to bring that concept up. Yeah, because it's so unnecessary for Spock to narratively be injured in this book.
Yeah, except I think that it takes Spock off the board for large portions, because I don't think Carey's interested in him. Diane Duane is a writer who I think of as being very interested in Spock. She wrote literally Spock's World, which is one of the great early Star Trek novels. I don't think Carey is particularly interested in Spock and just kind of sees him as a hurdle that she needs to get over.
Yeah.
Where Spock occasionally chimes, because it's not like Kirk spends a lot of time in sickbay with Spock. That's the thing. He worries about Spock, and he is concerned about Spock, but he doesn't spend a lot of time doting over Spock. He doesn't spend every waking hour worried about Spock. His thoughts don't idly drift to Spock in the middle of negotiations or whatever, which I think is maybe the difference between this and something slashier, as it were.
Yeah.
Whereas I think there are elements of it, but I don't think it's central. What about yourself?
Oh, well, I picked up on elements of slashing. I thought, the fondness was obviously very clear, and you're right, that sort of men together in the heat of battle thing is right from that start. But I actually thought the weird dynamic in this was, and I don't actually think it's one that's inappropriate or kind of betraying the original series' mood or anything. In this, it almost comes across, because as you say, for large parts of the narrative, Spock is essentially grounded. It almost comes across that Kirk and McCoy are like his feuding parents. They're like the parents who have to keep, like disciplining him and sending him back to his bedroom, and kind of like he keeps sneaking out essentially.
Yeah. and again, you do have that dynamic. So much of this is the dynamic between Kirk and McCoy. And again, I don't think that's a coincidence. Carey is a writer who like leans towards militaristic Star Trek. Like her first novel, her first Star Trek tie-in novel was Dreadnought with an exclamation mark. I do like to think that her contribution to Invasion was at least partially the exclamation mark in the title. That like Ordover was like, I think it's called Invasion, and Carey's like, no, I have a note, and it's just exclamation mark. But I do think that like, if you look at something like, say, Balance of Terror, which is obviously the enemy below, I think a lot, when I read a lot of the McCoy-Kirk conversations in this, I think of those exchanges between Kirk and McCoy in Balance of Terror, don't destroy the one called Kirk. Because that's one of the episodes where I really think that, like, Kirk and McCoy are more central than Kirk and Spock, because Spock obviously has the separate story in Balance of Terror that's about like his heritage and the fact that he looks like a Romulan and the tension that creates on the bridge. But I wonder if maybe that was the influence there. I wonder if like Carey was just like, no, I like the submarine warfare one where Kirk and McCoy hang out a bit. So that's kind of what I'm going to lean into.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you brought up Balance of Terror, because, I mean, firstly, when you talk about that sort of glorification of combat, both the, ground combat and the physical, the space combat, which are in this book, I thought of that thing about, because you mentioned Wagon Train to the Stars before. I thought again of the Hornblower in space thing, because this is very much a sort of, it feels like very Hornblower-y. But Balance of Terror is very Hornblower-y, amongst the other things you cited for it, and this definitely has, with Xena, like this has the, in a different, he practically paraphrases, you and I could be friends in a different world again. Yeah. And it's got very much that vibe of like, the captains instantly bond because they are kind of, by being captains, they are sort of higher than other men, really, is kind of the implication. And, they can at least be noble, but like the ultimate nobility is they have to put aside that friendship to destroy each other, essentially.
To serve their interests, because like, well, basically this very Hobbesian view that like all civilization is conflict, and your best bet is to hitch your wagon to whoever is going to win that conflict.
Yeah.
Sorry, I make it sound grimmer than it is. It's a fun pulpy read.
Oh no, I think I should restate as well. I like this book actually. I really enjoyed rereading it, and it's going to be so interesting if I do revisit the later ones, because I can't remember this being the good one. So if there are any flaws I find in this, well, no, I'll restate that a bit later. There are other good ones, but or interesting ones certainly. But I sort of remember this being the most consistent, which it might be. So we'll see how that goes. I think the Balance of Terror thing's there. I was thinking, I said in terms of Next Generation episodes, this echoes. I thought a cool thing about the ending of this book was, you were saying before about the fact that Carey has this, almost like showrunner role here in sort of setting up the concept and setting it up, not just in terms of being the first book, but being the one that's marooned a century before the others, of sort of setting it up. I thought the ending where Xena, his ship's been destroyed and he sent his sort of last message out to, where they're from. We don't really know where they're from at this stage in the book series, but it's it's the ending of Conspiracy again, isn't it? It's the ending of Q Who as well. It's They Will Be Coming, basically, isn't it? Yeah. Which I thought was a really interesting, because obviously those episodes would have been a few years old now, and they're sort of like bringing stuff like that in. And I actually thought it was very interesting that obviously this is not something TOS could have done deliberately, because people writing the original TOS
nobody knew,
didn't know TNG.
Who knew that Next Generation?
But it does strike me as odd that almost like the Next Generation didn't really, and you might correct me if I'm wrong here, if I'm forgetting something, they didn't really do an episode like that where something that was set up in the original series with a sort of ticking clock element, or at least you could retcon it to be a ticking clock element, sort of comes back, I guess you could say that's basically what Wrath of Khan is, obviously the movie series. But I can't think, although obviously some TNG brings back some TOS characters and concepts and things like that. They do the Naked Now, things like that, they do remakes essentially. There's nothing in the original series that's sort of set up with maybe this is a nascent alien threat, and then they use the decades on, the century on thing in TNG to be like, now this is a really big alien threat, like that would be kind of
they retroactively do it on Enterprise with the Borg in Regeneration, where they try and set that up as like a bootstrap paradox.
Oh, that's the other thing they do. So so in a sense, that's almost them doing the Q Who thing twice, really.
it's a lot to unpack. Like it's a great idea, so good we used it twice. But yeah, that's the example that I kind of think of, is the one where it's like they go, okay, well this will pay off in the show we have already made, which is a great way of doing it to make sure that you get that. It's a great way of avoiding that Netflix thing where you have a season of television, just cancel it so the cliffhanger never gets resolved. What if you make the resolution and then go back and make the cliffhanger? Yeah. But yeah, I think it's a very clever structural way of integrating a version of Star Trek that is very distant from the rest of the franchise. And like that's the thing with TOS, is the fact that like it is aesthetically different, it is temporally different, it's culturally different, it's different in terms of tone and style. It is quite distinct from the Berman era, which, as I think we both kind of conceded, was at its peak, its pinnacle in the 30th anniversary year, where you had First Contact, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager all happening simultaneously. I think that ending is a really good hook that it allows you to do, as you said, have your cake and eat it, where this story is self-contained and apart from it all and works on its own merits, but also, as you say, sets up something that can be like, and 100 years later, the next event happened. The next chapter happened 100 years later, which is a nice way of doing it. But again, I think more broadly, and it's kind of weird to look back on the franchise as it exists now, where everything is interconnected, where like the second season of Strange New Worlds will feature a crossover with Lower Decks, the animated Star Trek show, for example. And Lower Decks did an episode that was basically a crossover with Deep Space Nine, with Nana Visitor and Arma Shimmer and all this sort of stuff in it. But it's weird to think of how rarely the Berman era shows crossed over with one another. I mean, obviously you had like the Maquis arc, which ran through like Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and into Voyager, and then ironically back to Deep Space Nine. You obviously had recurring characters like Q, Worf, Kern, all that sort of stuff. Loxana, Troy, for example, Barclay and Riker. But it's interesting that we never got this crossover on television. It's interesting that you never saw a premise like, let's do Invasion, but like, I know you couldn't do it because it's syndicated, but it's like, Thursday night, all 3 hours of Star Trek are going to be this one epic event, like a Law and Order or a CSI crossover. It's weird. It's weird that never occurred to like Berman or any of the writers.
Yeah, instead we just get things like weird oddities, like, is it like Birthright Part 1 and stuff like that, where you get, Bashir and Data hanging out and talking about his dreams for a bit. Again, what a weird show.
Yeah, like, I love that. I actually, like, in hindsight, I kind of prefer that level of crossover, where, like, it's like Riker has been to Quark's and Quark, like, owes him some money. That sort of thing. Or, like, The Defiant, which is, like, one of my favorite crossovers ever, where it's, like, you think you're getting, like, a cynical Generations tie-over with Jonathan Frakes visiting Deep Space Nine, and then he, like, pulls off the sideburns in one of my favorite reveals in the history of television. And it's like, it's not William Riker. It's William Riker's evil transporter twin from that episode you almost forgot. And by the way, this episode is going hardcore on DS9 lore.
Yeah. Oh, it's great. I wanted to ask you, because we were talking about the character of Kellen before. I kind of want to talk to you like just briefly about the Klingons in First Strike, because it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's a 96 book, so it's taking the TOS Klingons. It's set in the TOS era, as we say. It's set after Friday's Child, where the Klingons play a role, admittedly a kind of fairly underdeveloped role in terms of like where they were at with that. Am I right in saying Friday's Child was the second episode with the Klingons in? Is it something like that?
I think that makes sense. That makes sense chronologically, yeah.
I might be getting that from one of your own essays, actually. So
okay, but it's like it's one of the episodes where they're like, what if we make them less yellow face? And it's like, after a little while, they're like, nah, that's not working for us.
Yeah. By the way, did you notice that they didn't mention the Organian peace treaty in this whole book?
Yeah, I noticed that never really. Well, to be fair, there is a whole bunch of, well, we can still fight, right? It's like, as long as we don't like escalate into planetary bombardment, we're fine.
Yeah, but it's odd that they, this does threaten to escalate several times throughout, though, and no one mentions. But do you remember there's that God race that won't let us do that?
Yeah.
Do you remember that happened last year? That was weird, wasn't it?
Like it's also weird that it's like, I don't know. It's weird that it's Friday's Child as well. That's the one this jumps off, and not say A Private Little War, which is a much more iconic like episode. It's weird that, like, 'cause I don't think anybody remembers Friday's Child. I think you mentioned watching Friday's Child for this and having a bizarre experience, because it's
so strange.
It's not what I would consider a classic episode, and I don't think it's a particularly well remembered episode. And I was like, why is David watching it? And then I read it, and I get to the section where it's like, by the way, all these giant men covered in purple and pink, like really tight unitards were throwing rocks.
I love that they're in the fight, and you went to take the fight seriously, and then I watched Friday's Child. I was like, oh, these guys. I was what I thought was interesting was the way that also, because we were talking about whether Diane Carey sort of idealizes the original series or Kirk or the Starfleet, all this kind of things. What I thought was weird is that it's set up as a sequel to Friday's Child, where the whole thing is the Enterprise thought they'd sorted the problem out. They drive the equivalent of about 3 blocks away, and then they have to turn around because they clearly didn't.
But it's only so they can give those dastardly Klingons a bloody note. Like, there's a sense reading it that, like, Diane Carey's big note on Friday's Child was they should have roughed up the Klingons a bit rougher. Like, it's like they went a bit easy on ye old Klingons in the end of it.
Well, it's also like Friday's Child, with all its flaws and problematicness and everything. It's kind of like, thank God we averted a war. And she's like, no, let's have the war as well.
It's like, you missed the best part, the war. Because, there is something when you read, and again, it's very well written, it's very dramatic, it's very effective, it's very pulse-pounding. It's, again, really good in terms of, propulsive prose. But it's this is more exciting than I think Klingon wars tended to be. When you get to, in the original series, even in A Private Little War, which is, man, it's a shame that we have to, stage this proxy war with the Klingons, but I guess we kind of have to, because otherwise innocent people will die. But we feel really bad about it. And then you flip through the opening pages of Invasion, and it's Kirk was like, man, my security team are fucking awesome. Look at them fucking go.
Yeah, there's a lot of that, yeah. That also struck me as very Hornblower, all the sort of not gay, honestly, we're not gay, sort of admiration for the young men that are under him, stuff like that, and all the nobility of them, but having to train them up and stuff. But the reason I mentioned the Klingons was, you've already brought up the Kazon and kind of what 90s Star Trek was doing with them and everything like that. Obviously, the Klingons are such an iconic Star Trek race, but there's this entire, I was going to say there are essays to be written about this. You've written several of them about the Klingons and their nature of, the way they've been treated. You were referencing Yellowface before, that the way they've been exoticized in TOS in the most obvious way, but into Next Generation in a different way, in species essentialist ways, in ways that mirror sort of imperial cultures that Ronald D. Moore in particular was fascinated by, stuff like that, and also, making them genre tropes, samurai tropes, that kind of thing. I thought it's interesting that these are TOS Klingons, but written in the 90s, they're kind of taking on board things about the sort of later Klingons. But they're also, in this, Kirk and the Enterprise crew and the Federation, they're stuck between the Furies and the Klingons, aren't they? And the Klingons, I think they say something about, we can't give in to our savage natures here, but the Klingons are giving into this all the time, aren't they? That's their big defining thing. And I mean, even Kellen's a weird character in this, because I remember him being a very cool, sophisticated character, and in this I realised that obviously that was me as a 10-year-old.
No,
he's not, but he's set up as this weird, the one Klingon who makes rational decisions.
The Vulcan Klingon.
Exactly, and then for the rest of the book, I guess you could say she's making a slightly OTT point about how scared he is. Even this rational man, this uber rational man, can be driven to this. But it just comes across as odd because he's like a child for the rest of the book. Yeah,
he's like, what is the problem, and can I stab it? And it's that doesn't feel like a very Vulcan Klingon. That feels like a very Klingon from one of the bad episodes of the original Star Trek Klingon.
I was going to say, why don't you just bring back Core or something? If you're doing something like this, why don't you just bring back a typical Klingon, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, what I find interest, and again, something I latched on to, is how repeatedly it mentions that he's fat. There's a weird emphasis on the idea of Kellen as this chubby Klingon, which is that's the part that feels most like Next Generation or kind of Deep Space Nine or Voyager about it, where when I think of the original Klingons from the original Star Trek, most of them are fairly, I know obviously Friday's Child is the exception with its balding short Klingon, but most of them are very tall, very macho, very again, very well-defined physical features. It's not until you get to the portrayal of the Empire in Decline in the Next Generation where you start seeing these kind of rotund Klingons, Kimpek, for example, all that sort of stuff. And I think even Star Trek V, for example, has one as well. And it's kind of just weird because I was kind of imagining like this Kimpek-esque figure running around, crawling through the Jeffries tube, randomly stabbing aliens, and I'm like,
I think I was picturing Kimpek as well. Actually, come to think of it,
yeah. I don't know what this novel wants me to think about this character, because again, as you said, it introduces him as this calm, rational figure. He's at times it seems like he's being mirrored with Kirk. Like there's this interesting thing that happens, and again, we mentioned the marginalization of Spock. It's fascinating that the climax of the novel, Carey basically writes out the entire senior staff. So it's just Kirk and a bunch of like junior staffers so that he can like...
That was interesting, wasn't it? I noticed that when Sulu, I think it was a few pages after Sulu basically has to go to sickbay.
Yeah, Byers takes over and like Kirk is like, well, Byers is only here because he's got like a famous relative or somebody's pushing him very hard. And I think Keller has a comment about one of his subordinates earlier in the novels. I'm like, am I meant to think Keller is an equivalent to Kirk? And it's like, no, I'm not. But there is that weird thing when you get to the climax where it's Kirk on the Enterprise with this crew of nobodies taking on the Klingons and the Wrath. And it really does feel like that's Carey's way of going, you know how awesome Kirk is? He can do this without the Enterprise crew.
Yeah, doesn't need any of them, and he'll lead the Klingons.
Yeah.
Do you think this could be read as First Strike could be read as just Kirk having a coma dream, basically? His world's just collapsing in on itself, and this is kind of, as his mind shrinks into itself, this is what he's left with.
It does have like Star Trek V, The Final Frontier vibes, which is like Shatner writing Kirk, where like, what is the one worthy adversary for James Tiberius Kirk? And in The Final Frontier, it's like God. Here, it's like the devil. There is that sense
McCoy has that line where it figures you'd get on with the devil, right?
Yeah. Well, even the devil would like you. You're that fucking charming.
Yeah, I guess that's the other implication.
Yeah. But like, I find it interesting that this, like reading this, I was like, I like Kirk, but I'm feeling uncomfortable with like how much this book likes Kirk. I'm like, I feel like this book needs to talk about something other than Kirk. It needs to like find something else to interest it.
Yeah. Well, and you've also got, something I noticed as an adult reading it as well, of course, is how sketched in the Furies are as characters, because you've basically, it's worse than I remembered in the sense that you've basically just got Xena and Garamanis, the priest, the Dana figure,
the captain and the priest, yeah.
Exactly, yeah, which is obviously such an old dynamic and such an old kind of mythic thing, and and like kind of like the most basic political squabble you can write as well, isn't it? In terms of this sort of thing. But we'll see how the rest of the series goes if we get around to it. But I seem to remember they're almost the only Fury characters you ever get as well. Like that's kind of, they become a very sort of not faceless, because they're they're obviously all about their grotesquerie and their kind of outlandish appearances, but they become, this is like from what I remember, and I'll eat my words on reread, but they this is kind of as characterful as they become, almost.
Well, again, that's the Carey thing that I find interesting, because like when I was reading this, I remembered it being more atmospheric, and obviously parts of it are, you have the description of like the deck where you can't see your feet because there's so much fog, the fact that there's moss and skull around and all that sort of stuff, the fact that they have these like voodoo dolls around their necks and all this sort of stuff, or mirrors hanging from their necks, the fact that they look like minotaurs or Medusas, kind of, the fact that they lock McCoy in a wicker man at the climax as well, which I
like
find
we got this far without mentioning that scene.
Yeah, but like I remember it being weirder than it was, because I think like what's really interesting is that during the opening chapters with the Klingons, Carey cuts to like the inside of the Fury vessel with the Furies talking to one another by name, and obviously she doesn't describe them or anything like that, but it does this weird thing of making them seem less alien. It makes them seem more like they're just dudes who happen to have snakes in their hair. What's your big problem?
It'd be funny if Xena had a yeoman, like he's brought coffee at some point as well.
Well, like that's the thing. It's like when Kirk goes to the bridge of this, and there's this paragraph about like how disturbing and unsettling it is that there are skulls in the fabric of the wall. But then it's like, but it was also recognizably a bridge. There was a chair in the middle of it and an oblong panel at the front that was clearly a helm console. And it's like, it feels like this alien ship isn't actually that alien. That seems to be what you're telling me here, which is a strange choice when the concept is meant to be that they're these Lovecraftian, like monstrous horrors that evoke these primal feelings within people. Like there's this central recurring motif that obviously because Kirk is the central character and because Carey doesn't really put you in the heads of other people that often, there is this recurring suggestion that like people are just fundamentally uncomfortable around the Furies. Scotty giving the tour, McCoy, the Klingons obviously, but like it's weird when you read it because it doesn't feel like that. It feels like they're just just guys. They're just people. They're just.
Well, you know what? It's interesting that Carey doesn't go back to that, does it? Because you don't get any more of them just talking to each other after that.
Yeah.
This is again the thing of being so close to Kirk for most of it, and I think that's a flaw. That could just a few more scenes of that could flesh it out so much more in terms of the political squabbles and the kind of difference over doctrine.
Oh yeah, because that happens off screen at the climax. Like Kirk shows up and they're already in the middle of the argument. You haven't seen the start of it. Like it's weird. Yeah.
Exactly, and I'm really glad you mentioned the discomfort of the Furies because, of the Federation characters at the Furies and the Klingons at the Furies, because there is this almost like racialized but mythologized as well, loathing for them, isn't there? And obviously that does get developed on in the rest of the series and stuff, and we've already got an idea of what it consists of here, and you've got the idea that the Furies, although perhaps we, so to speak, are not the conquerors, but we do loathe these things, and we have monsterized them over the years through collective memory and myth and stuff. But the thing it really reminded me of, and I only thought this when we were talking earlier a bit about DS9, is do you remember the second series episode of DS9? I think it's called Sanctuary.
With the refugees, yeah.
With the refugees, yeah. Because obviously there are some sort of superficial plot similarities here as well. Like a group of people come through the wormhole, they think that Bajor is their sort of promised land, don't they? So it's not where they're from necessarily, but it's where they want to be and believe they're destined to be. And there's a way
in which they're then, and particularly like the makeup choices where they have kind of like flaking skin and stuff, which makes them look human but also kind of unsettling.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? They all look essentially like a mixture between people with bad eczema and kind of a leper colony, essentially. So it's kind of they are. Quote unquote repulsive, and that's the way they're portrayed, is that they give people bad vibes essentially. And I think that's a really interesting thing, because that episode would have been a couple of years old when this came out as well. So I've got no idea if Diane Carey had seen that episode, but it felt that the similarity echoed through to me there, I think.
Well, I mean, and again, like it's worth noting that there are like in a lot of this is American pop culture in general. You have like California's working through. It's kind of attitude towards immigration. The argument that like 90s Californian politics is like the melting pot that gives you Stephen Miller, that gives you Donald Trump. But the idea that like when you look at Voyager touches on themes around like refugees and immigration in ways that are very uncomfortable, where like it's like Displaced, which is the one where all of a sudden aliens start showing up on Voyager, and initially they seem harmless, but oh no, those aliens are literally coming for our jobs. They are coming to replace you and to take over the ship and invade you just by showing up. Or is it like Day of Honor, which is the one where you have the refugees who've been rendered homeless by the Borg, and they're like really needy and really grabby, and then also like kind of unpleasant and ungrateful, and the episode's like, yeah, these guys kind of stink. There is a weird kind of like thing running through 90s Star Trek with regards to immigration, with regards to refugees, with regards to like dispossessed individuals, which is kind of interesting to unpack, and particularly to go back and to look at now in the context of like a science fiction franchise that's rooted in 90s California in particular.
Oh, definitely. And I've realised we were sort of talking about the Wicker Man scene before. I was talking before about Star Trek as horror, and I was talking about the gonzo elements of the books. Sometimes, like I said, I was drawn to that book Fallen Heroes, the DS9 novel, because of the gonzo horror, partly because it could do these OTT things. The series couldn't. I think a reason I like this, and I'm not saying I was wrong to, but when I was about 10, 11 is, there's that horrific bit when Kellen saws that creature's head off and holds it up. I sent you the page view of that the other day. And said, wow. And there's like Garamanis, that Zena and him have that confrontation, and he's essentially like garroted and then burned alive. Like on screen as it would be if this was an episode. And it's kind of mind blowing, isn't it?
Yeah, and the novelization is like, no, we're continuing. Like the novel continues after that point. Kirk is like, well, thank goodness that hasn't scarred me horribly. Let's continue with the adventure. Like, again, like it is insane how, and again, I guess this is down to like Carey's writing style, which is very but matter of fact. It's very easy to read, which is a compliment to it. I got through this book tremendously quickly, which is a compliment to it. But like there is something very strange when you process that stuff, when you get to the end of a chapter and you think about that, like the incredibly graphic detail about Kellen sawing through the alien as like the gunk covers his hands, and like not quite pausing to acknowledge the horror of it, but just the factualness of it, where it's like, yeah, your hands would get covered.
That's like Clive Barker-y stuff, it's like, it's getting there. I mean, I thought as well. It comes back at the end, when Xenor, has that sort of like he has some of the final communications with Kirk, when they're about to battle and stuff. And Kirk's like, did you look at the evidence? He's like, yeah, I looked at the evidence, and I think he meant to bleak reference it, but like the unspoken, mostly unspoken thing is like, I just burned a guy alive for you, like someone that I've worked with for years.
And you maybe could have brought this up a little earlier. Like that's the bit that I find really interesting is that Kirk is like, I do feel a little guilty about not bringing it up a little earlier, but on the other hand, water under the bridge. Am I right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you talk about Kirk/Spock before, there's a version of this you could read where, Xena felt he had to kill Garamanus, but maybe there was something there, because he actually calls the Last Stand like the Battle of Garamanus, doesn't he? He dedicates it to him, So is this basically a warped tale where we've seen a sort of swapped version of like where maybe like a character like Kirk has been lied to so much that he's had to burn Spock alive for what he thought was the greater good, and now he's learned that it was bullshit.
I mean, isn't that like that's the thing where I'm kind of wondering, like, aren't they meant to be? Obviously, Xenor is a mirror to Kirk. Is the priest meant to be a mirror to Keller? Like that's the thing. Like, are those the two that exist?
I suppose he is really. Yeah. He's the guy who won't be swayed from his course, isn't he? So
yeah, much like Keller. And again, that's the thing where it's like Spock really doesn't feel like he's very important to any of this. Which is, I guess, is good. Like, there's enough Spock media out there. It's just rather strange that it's like this is the first big pocketbooks crossover event, and it's like all Kirk all the time, baby.
Yeah, although you just get one bit where he gets to lie to Nurse Chapel, which feels kind of cruel as well. Again, because he's sneaking out of his room.
Yeah, it's again like the kid. I do like McCoy seems more concerned about Spock than Kirk does. Like the moment where they like smuggle McCoy under their vests back to the ship, where McCoy is like, "Oh, what have they done to Spock? Why isn't Spock talking?" Which is arguably more concern, I think, than Kirk demonstrates for Spock at any given moment.
Yeah, that's a weird wrinkle, isn't it? Because, McCoy is genuinely furious, obviously from a professional perspective, that apart from anything else, that Kirk has kept Spock standing around with, was it broken ribs or whatever? To basically, so he could have a second opinion during this chat with a Klingon. Yeah. And like Kirk, to give her credit as an author, like Kirk also is like, wow, I just did that. That's kind of messed up.
No, and again, I do like that Carey goes out of the way and it's like, look, it's a responsibility. She talks about him staying up all night to write the letters to the family members and to talk about how important the planet was strategically, and kind of the sense in which he's doing this to assuage his own guilt. Like, he stayed up late because he couldn't sleep without doing it, kind of thing. Like, I think
he can't sleep until he's done that, and he knows that about himself.
Yeah, and I do think like Carey, I don't think, again, Carey, I think, is very much a Kirk fan, but I do think that there is some interesting stuff there about the idea of Kirk as you kind of suggested, as a man of war, as like a man who is in some ways kind of like attracted to the idea of combat and battle and destruction and death, but who is uncomfortable with that.
Yeah, he's kind of got a thirst for blood. I would say. I'd also go a bit further. Like, he has that element in common with the Klingon, I guess. I suppose, as they're portrayed non-judgmentally. As they are portrayed in this book and indeed a lot of other Star Trek media. Yeah,
except he has the rationality to keep that in check. Again, he's like Xenor. He's like, he's able to put that, to create the gap between himself and that bloodlust.
And this is again where it's extremely problematic, isn't it? Because that's the old trope of like, the kind of the one of us who can go amongst the quote-unquote savages and fight alongside them.
Yes.
But also literally, as you were pointing out, lead them into battle at the end.
The dances with wolvesness of it, basically, yeah.
And Tarzan and everything, just so many tropes.
Where even the most rational Klingon, even the most respected Klingon, even the most carefully considered Klingon must still bow down and trust that only James Tiberius Kirk can lead the Empire to glory. Yeah. Yeah, there. Now that you mentioned, there is a bit of like dances with wolves to this.
We were talking before about the space combat, and they kind of, frankly, slightly overlong space battle that ends this book. Because I quite like space battles and stuff. But like I was like, this is going on a bit.
Yeah, 3 chapters of a 21 chapter book is a lot.
Yeah. Well, it's just the repetitive nature of it as well. And, but one thing it really reminded me of, talking again, going back to 96 and things I was getting into, N64 games and stuff, it's almost like a Lilac Wars boss or something, because you've got the Fury ship taking all the phaser power and disruptor power and then firing it back at them, and the Klingons being essentially too stupid to realise that that's what's happening, which is kind of seems a bit odd as well. But then, that you've got, it's like the boss battle logic, isn't it? You have to find the weak spot, though. You have to find the bit where the opening.
You have
where
to figure out the rules of this combat and then kind of like get into. I can hear the kind of 90s like video game music playing in the background as Kirk pilots the ship via Byers.
Yeah,
I do
exactly, and the boss health bar going slowly down when they actually get the opening.
And while you're mentioning the space combat, I did while I was reading it, I was taken by how much it feels like Carey was maybe influenced by the motion picture, the opening of the motion picture, where like the opening section of this is the Klingons encounter something in the dead of space and Kirk has to step in and fix the mess. And it's kind of interesting that Carey is like, but let's make this more about like how Kirk has to fix the Klingons' mess.
That is almost the same as the V'ger introduction, isn't it? I hadn't thought about that. That's interesting. Actually, you know what? Another brief sidebar. I meant to talk about Gonzo elements of the thing, but not horror this time. Kind of ambitious sci-fi. That opening is both very impressive. Where the entire solar system goes to warp because of the Fury's weird transport system.
They reduce the mass, isn't it?
Yeah. It's very cool. It's a very cool, borderline plausible, maybe if you squint, sort of sci-fi idea. But it's also completely pointless, and also it doesn't specifically
doesn't come back at all. Like, I completely love the sequence where Kirk is like, so they can't do that again, then, right? That's not something we have to worry about again, right?
Well, the large ship comes through and it doesn't Spock or something just say about, guess they fixed that or something like that. Yeah. So, why do you... I mean, it makes an impact, don't get me wrong, it's a really cool start, but, why beyond just set-pieceism, I suppose?
To be honest, though, that feels like a bit that Carey's like, I did that once for you, and I'm not doing it again. And we're going straight back to Hornblower, baby. It's like, you get one cool high-concept science fiction premise, and we're going straight back to, as you said, boss battle kind of logic.
It also sort of strikes you as maybe like you read an article where there was that someone made the point that might if you tweak this one thing that might
if you
happen.
change mass,
and she was just like, oh, that's cool, we'll just get that in.
Yeah. But not in a way where it's central to the narrative or I have to pursue the concept any further. Because it's a really reading it's that bit where it does feel alien, where it does feel genuinely alien and like nothing you've ever read in Star Trek before. And then it's kind of odd that you get straight to like Balance of Terror, like Kirk and McCoy, and in another life I might have called you friend kind of logic.
Yeah. Well, isn't one of the things... do they talk about how the Furies have basically just destroyed an entire solar system by accident as well? Because we're banding around phrases like war crimes and this and stuff.
There's a bit at the end that I like where Keller's like, look, where Kirk is like, by the way, I just want you to know I'll be filing an extradition request with the Klingon High Council for that security officer and ambassador that you murdered. But by the way, it was a pleasure working with you.
Well, he says I'll be testifying against you, but I'll also be testifying to how you helped prevent a war on Capella. And I'm like, so what's this trial going to look like? I really want to see the trial.
Yeah, Kirk is both prosecutor and defendant. He just runs between the two desks, objecting to his own arguments.
Now I would watch the hell out of that episode, Darren.
Oh, do you reckon he'll ask Kyle to put him through the transporter again and see if he can split into good Kirk and evil Kirk?
You're talking about The Enemy Within, but if it was a lawyer show.
Yeah.
Amazing.
I mean, obviously it would be, what's the practice? What's the spin-off with Denny Crane?
Oh, yeah, Boston Legal.
Boston Legal.
Well, I was going to say it's Better Call Saul, basically.
Fair.
I'm really minded to go back to the other three now. I'm definitely going to try. I think they're even harder to track down copies of online, so that might be a stumbling block pragmatically.
Oh, because they weren't given away for free with Star Trek Magazine.
I think you might be onto something. Yeah. Well, Darren, we'll wrap up in a sec, but I just wanted to give you a chance before you plug your stuff, obviously. I just wanted to give you a chance to any last thoughts on this, and I guess kind of what the experience of rereading this has been like.
No, it was a pleasure. Thank you for asking me. It was great to get the invitation. It was great to get an excuse to revisit this stuff. I really did have a good time reading it. I hope I haven't seemed too negative or too complainy. A lot of it does come from places of affection, and I think it was kind of fun to revisit. Again, that pang of nostalgia that you feel, where I as I said, I remembered reading it and like conjuring up these memories of not only my opinions of the book that I read as a child, but also of other books that I read as a child, and being like, oh yeah, I had really strong feelings about these things that I have completely forgotten. I've locked away in my memory palace. So no, thank you very much for the invitation. I really, really appreciate it.
Oh, absolute pleasure. I mean, I said I was going to let you tell people where to find you online and what you've been up to recently. Please do.
Perfect. Yeah. So I'm at Darren_Mooney on Twitter. You can find me there. I write at The Escapist. So Google Darren Mooney Escapist. I'll be talking about stuff. So I co-host a podcast called The 250 with my good friend Andrew Quinn, where we look at the IMDb's top 250 movies of all time. If this is coming out towards the end of June, there is every possibility that it'll be coming out the week before we cover Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, completing our Indiana summer season, looking at James Mangold's upcoming Indiana Jones film franchise. If it comes out a bit later, we'll probably be talking about Mission Impossible Fallout Dead Reckoning. If it comes out a bit later, we'll probably be talking about Oppenheimer and/or Barbie. So you can find lots of discussion of very relevant, very hip movies in this massive summer season that we're having. Outside of that, you can, again, follow me on Twitter, give me a shout, come yell at me about movies. And yeah, that's really what I'm up to.
Great. Thanks, Darren. I know I've made several joking references to it before, but at your website, the M0vie Blog, there really is a tremendous amount of Star Trek writing on there. And I can't emphasize that enough.
Too much.
There's a lot. So basically, if you like any particular version of Star Trek and you want to hear quite, amazingly detailed critiques and interesting discussion of them, there's a lot there, and I've certainly read a lot of it over the years, and I really appreciated reading it. So I would steer anyone in that direction, and I'll put links in the show notes.
Oh, absolutely fantastic. I will say that writing about Voyager was a lot. Writing about the original Star Trek, writing about Deep Space Nine, writing about the bits of the Next Generation, writing about Enterprise were interesting. Voyager was the one where it was like I did feel as I was getting towards the end that I had maybe written enough words in my life.
Yeah, I think anyone who's watched sizable amounts of Voyager, apart from the most hardcore fans, will probably know what you mean by that.
Yeah.
But yeah, well, thanks, Darren. Thanks for joining us. That was absolutely fantastic. And we'll be back with more EscapeGoat podcasts before too long in the rest of this fourth series. Say bye-bye, Darren.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone. You've been listening to the EscapeGoat podcast, hosted by David Fagiani. If you want to contact the podcast with any feedback or thoughts, you can leave comments on our Libsyn page or under our YouTube videos, or email us at escapegoatpod@gmail.com. You can also reach the show on Twitter on @egoat_pod and follow us for new episode notifications. This podcast is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, as well as our Libsyn site, escapegoatpodcast.libsyn.com. Original intro, outro, and any other incidental music for this podcast is composed, produced, and made available by permission of Richard Gilbert.